The line moved forward one child at a time, and Kaya Reyes lay flat on the roof tile above the plaza and made herself breathe slow, because the alternative was screaming, and screaming got you nothing on Halcyon except a place at the front of that line. Below her, in the square that used to hold the harvest market, 600 colonists knelt in rows with their hands bound behind them, and in front of the rows stood the children, 40 of them left out of the 91 the Dominion had swept up from the North settlements 3 days ago. A Corvin officer in polished gray plate walked the line with a data slate, reading names off a manifest in a flat administrative voice, and every few names a soldier stepped forward, took a child by the shoulder, and walked them to a raised steel platform at the square's center, where an overseer in dark blue robes waited with a recording drone hovering at his shoulder. It was not fast. That was the thing nobody who hadn't seen it ever understood. It was not a massacre, not the chaos of a bombing run or a burning building. It was administrative. It had a rhythm. A name was called. A child walked or was walked to the platform. The overseer asked a question. The child answered, or didn't, or screamed, or begged, or went silent the way small animals go silent when a larger one has already decided what happens next. Then it was over, and the drone recorded a number, and the line moved forward one child at a time. Kaya had counted 14 since she'd taken this position at dawn. She made herself stop counting after 14, because the number wasn't the point anymore. The point was Ren, 9th from the front, 7 years old, wearing the yellow coat she'd been wearing when the Dominion troop carriers came down over the grain silos, standing so still in that line that from the roof line she looked less like a girl and more like something cut from paper and stood up in the dirt. Kaya's earpiece crackled once, twice, the militia band cutting through static. Raise, report. Commander Des Okonkwohale's voice, low and graveled, from the tree line half a click out where what was left of Halcyon's defense force was dug into the culvert and trying not to be seen by the 3 Dominion cruisers sitting in low orbit like circling gulls. 40 left, Kaya breathed into the mic, barely moving her lips. She's 9th, I can see her. You are not going down there. I know. Say it like you mean it, Corporal. I'm not going down there, Kaya said, and it was almost true, and Okonkwohale let it go because there was nothing else to do with it. Below her, another name was called. Another child walked. The overseer's voice carried up thin and clear in the too quiet morning air. The same 3 questions every time. And Kaya had learned the pattern of it the way you learn the pattern of anything you cannot look away from. Designation. Settlement of origin. Do you understand why this is happening? Most of them couldn't answer the 3rd question. Most of them were 7, 9, 11 years old, and the honest answer was no. Nobody understands why this is happening. There is no version of why that a child's mind can hold, and the overseer would wait exactly 4 seconds. Kaya had timed it, obsessively, uselessly, 4 seconds every time, and then nod to the soldier, and it would be over, and the number would climb by 1. She had heard, from a comms intercept 3 colonies back, that the resistance network had passed along like a piece of scripture. Nobody wanted to read twice. That there was a number. That the Dominion's whole terror campaign, all of it, the 11 worlds it had already broken this way, ran on a number, a target the Corvin statisticians had calculated years ago and never once revised, a number of documented child executions, broadcast sector-wide, past which no remaining world in range of the transmission would resist, past which the war, such as it was, simply ended because fear had reached what their models called saturation. Nobody in the resistance network knew the number, only that Halcyon was close to it. Close enough that this world, this square, this line of 40 children still waiting, had been chosen specifically to close the gap. Above the plaza, mounted on the old grain exchange building where the market clock used to hang, a Dominion propaganda drone unfolded a wide holographic banner that pulsed the sector's shared numeral system in cold blue light, updating with each name the overseer logged. Kaya had refused to read it for 3 days. She read it now. 5,719. 12 more, and whatever the number was, they'd have it. She put her forehead against the warm tile and closed her eyes and thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that the worst thing she had ever witnessed had a spreadsheet behind it. 3 kilometers above the plaza, in a command cradle that overlooked all 600 kneeling colonists on a real-time tactical feed, Emperor Dravan Kesari of the Ashfall Dominion watched the 12th-to-last name get called and felt, as he always did at this stage of a campaign, something close to peace. He did not think of himself as a monster. This was not vanity. He had simply run the arithmetic too many times across too many worlds to entertain a word that small. Monsters were undisciplined. Monsters enjoyed themselves badly, sloppily, in ways that left evidence a species could rally around. What Kesari did, he did with a precision that had ended 11 wars without 11 invasions, that had spared. He kept this number 2, privately, the only number he kept that no drone recorded, some 400 million soldiers, Corvin and otherwise, who would have died taking these worlds by force if the worlds had simply been allowed to believe they had a chance. Fear applied correctly was the cheapest weapon in the galaxy. It scaled without fuel, without logistics, without a single ship leaving orbit. You only had to prove once decisively on camera that resistance cost more than a species could bear to pay, and then you never had to prove it again. Word did the rest. His name did the rest. There were 3 systems right now, whose governing councils had surrendered the instant his flagship's transponder pinged their outer relays. No fleet, no ultimatum, nothing but the mere fact of his arrival, because word of Halcyon and of the 10 worlds before it had outrun him by months. He found this elegant. He suspected, on the nights he allowed himself to suspect things, that elegance was the last polite word for what he had become. He did not examine that suspicion further. It was not useful. Beside him in the cradle's secondary seat, Overseer Yeth Kalraman, his logothete, his statistician, the keeper of the tally since before Kesari had taken the Ashfall throne, watched the same feed through a narrower, more clinical lens, and had not spoken in 11 minutes, which for Yeth was itself a kind of alarm. "Say it," Kesari said, without turning his head. "You've had a thought since the 9th name. I can hear you not saying it." Yeth's quills flattened along the back of his neck, a small tell Kesari had learned to read across 4 decades of campaigns. The projection model is behaving oddly on this world, Majesty, nothing that changes the outcome. A variance in the response curve. Define oddly. The children are not afraid in the pattern we expect. Yeth pulled up a secondary window, a graph that meant nothing to anyone but him, decades of aggregated biometric and behavioral data from 11 prior campaigns, distilled into a bell curve so familiar to the Ashfall statistics core that the youngest analysts could sketch it from memory. On every world we have processed, the fear response follows this curve regardless of species, culture, or age cohort. 91% present overt terror. 6% present a masking behavior, false calm, performed stillness, which our reading protocols detect and log as suppressed terror, because it always is. It always resolves into terror in the final seconds. The remaining 3% are outliers we discard as noise. And Halcyon. Halcyon's children are presenting at 19% masking behavior, nearly triple the baseline. Yeth turned the graph so Kesari could see the anomalous spike without needing to understand the mathematics behind it. I flagged it as noise for the first 11 executions. I no longer believe it is noise. Kesari studied the spike for a moment longer than the topic strictly warranted, then dismissed it with the small economy of gesture that had trained an entire empire to stop raising concerns twice. Masking is still masking, Overseer. A performance collapses eventually. It always has. Yes, Majesty, Yeth said, and did not sound convinced, and logged the note anyway, because that was his function, and because some very old, very careful part of him, the part that had survived 4 decades at this man's side by never once being wrong in a report, did not like the shape of 19% at all. Below them, on the feed, the 12th to last name was called. A boy walked to the platform without being walked. The overseer of the ground detail asked his 3 questions. The boy answered the first 2 in a voice that did not shake, and when asked whether he understood why this was happening, said nothing at all, not from confusion. Kesari noted, watching the boy's eyes on the magnified feed with the particular attention he gave to eyes, always the eyes, because eyes were where a mask always eventually failed. He watched for the flicker, the tell. The moment the fear leaked through the comm the way it leaked through every comm he had ever tested, on every world in every war. He did not find it. The 4 seconds elapsed. He told himself, and half believed it, that the boy simply hadn't understood the question. The number climbed, 5,720. 11 more. Kesari had not always read eyes for a living. He had learned it the way every Corvin hatchling of his generation had learned it, on a colder world than any of the ones his fleet now humbled, under a warlord whose name the history archives had scrubbed so thoroughly that Kesari himself sometimes had to search for it. He remembered the warlord's tactics better than he remembered the name. He remembered a courtyard not unlike the one on the feed below him now, and a line of hatchlings not unlike the line still waiting in Halcyon Square, and his own sibling clutch, 6 of them, standing in that line while the warlord's officers walked the rows with a manifest. He remembered an elder, one of the clutch minders who had raised them all in the communal roost, crouching at his side in the dust and gripping his shoulder hard enough to leave marks and saying, very quietly, into the down still soft along his ear, "Be still. Whatever happens, be still. They cannot use what they cannot read." He had been still. He had stood in that line and watched 3 of his sibling clutch taken to a platform very like the one below him now, and he had not screamed, had not wept, had not let the terror show on his face even as it consumed every other part of him, because an old, terrified, half-starved elder had taught him that stillness was the only armor a hatchling with no other weapon could wear. And it had worked. He had survived. The warlord's officers had walked past him 3 times and found nothing to read and moved on, and he had told himself for 40 years that this was wisdom, that this was strength, that the lesson had been a gift disguised as horror. It had taken him most of a lifetime to understand that the stillness had never been the absence of fear. It had been fear with the volume turned all the way down, fear compressed into a smaller and smaller space, until it had nowhere left to go but inward, where it had stayed, coiled, informing every decision he had made since. He had built an empire on the discovery that stillness could be taught, that fear could be hidden, that the hiding itself proved the fear was real, because he had done it himself, and he knew, with the certainty of a man reading his own scar, exactly what a masked terror looked like from the outside. A held breath, a jaw locked half a degree too tight, eyes that didn't blink because blinking risked the whole performance. He had never, not once in 11 campaigns and 40 years, found a mask he couldn't eventually see through. He looked at the feed again, at the boy already being led away, already logged, already a number and nothing else, and told himself the boy's stillness had simply been too brief a sample. 11 more children. Plenty of chances left to find the tell. He did not look again at Yeth's graph. That was, in retrospect, the first mistake he made on Halcyon, though it would be hours before he understood it as one. Kaya came off the roof an hour before dusk, when the ground detail rotated shift and the plaza's eastern approach fell, for 11 minutes at a stretch, into a blind spot between 2 patrol sweeps. She had mapped the blind spot over 3 days of watching. 11 minutes was not enough to reach Ren. It was enough to reach the culvert. Okonkwo was waiting where the drainage tunnel opened into scrub brush. A big man gone gray at the temples, one arm in a field sling from the ambush at the north bridge that had cost Halcyon's militia 6 of its 40 fighters, and every heavy weapon they'd owned. He didn't ask her what she'd seen. He'd been watching his own feed off a scavenged relay dish, and his face had the particular stillness of a man who had run out of things to say about a number climbing on a blue banner 3 days running. "Fleet Command answered," he said instead, low, before she'd finished settling into the brush. "2 hours ago. Encrypted burst, one line, the Free World's fleet has a task group 4 days out, responding to the distress call the Halcyon relay station got off before it went dark." 4 days. Kaya did the arithmetic without wanting to. The banner's at 5,720. However many more they need, they'll have it before nightfall. "I know." "Then 4 days is a rescue for a graveyard, Des." "I know that too." Okonkwohale's jaw worked. "But it's what we've got, and I will not send what's left of this militia at 3 Corving cruisers and 1,100 ground troops on a suicide run that gets every one of us killed and doesn't slow the count by a single name. You know that math as well as I do. Better, probably. You've been running it on that roof for 3 days. Kaya said nothing, because he was right, and because the alternative to saying nothing was screaming, and screaming got you nothing. "There's a second option," Okonkwohale said, after a moment, and something in his voice made her look up. "Not a rescue. A recording. A recording. Every execution's already broadcast sector-wide. That's the whole point of the thing. It's meant to be seen. But it's their feed, their framing, their drone. What if there's a second signal riding alongside it that they don't control? One that shows what the broadcast doesn't. Not the killing. The room. The faces of the soldiers doing it. What it actually looks like from 100 meters closer than their propaganda unit ever points a camera." He met her eyes. "I've got a tech, Priya Anand, 19 years old. Sharpest signals mind this colony's produced in a generation. She thinks she can splice a low-power relay into the Dominion's own uplink tower, without them catching the tap for at least a day, maybe 2, if somebody gets close enough to physically plant it." "Close enough," Kaya repeated. "Into the tower, inside the security perimeter around the plaza." "Yes. That's not a rescue either." "No," Okonkwohale said. "It's worse odds than a rescue, and it saves fewer lives today, and I would not blame you if you told me to find someone else to ask, because I know exactly whose name is 9th in that line, and I know exactly what I'm asking you to walk past to get to that tower." His voice didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "But if the whole strategy runs on nobody ever seeing what it costs to build that number, then the one thing that might actually matter, more than 4 days, more than a task group that arrives too late for tonight, is making sure somebody outside this system sees it raw once, before the fleet gets here. Every world Kesari's terrified into surrendering did it on faith. Faith in a story nobody outside the kill zone ever got to check." Kaya looked back toward the plaza, invisible now behind the tree line, the banner's cold blue glow the only sign of it against the darkening sky. Ren was 9th. Ren would not be 9th by the time any relay Priya Anand built ever reached a receiver 2 systems over. "I'm not doing it to save her," Kaya said finally, quiet, more to herself than to him. "I want that understood. I can't save her tonight, I know that." "I know you know that. I'm doing it because somebody has to see what a number costs before they get to decide it's worth surrendering to." She checked the charge on her sidearm out of pure reflex, an old habit from a war that had started 3 weeks ago and felt, already, like it had lasted her whole life. "Get me Anand. Get me the relay. Tell me how close I have to get." The uplink tower stood at the plaza's northern edge, a repurposed grain silo the Dominion's engineers had crowned with a lattice of relay dishes in the first day of occupation, and getting to its base meant crossing 80 meters of open ground between the tree line and the perimeter fence with nothing but 2 patrol rotations, and a failing dusk for cover. Priya Anand had built the relay in 6 hours out of a scavenged medical scanner housing, and components Kaya didn't ask about. and she'd built it small enough to fit in a jacket pocket, which was the only reason the plan had a chance of working at all. It needs line of sight to the tower's primary dish for 11 seconds, Annan had told her, hands shaking slightly even as her voice stayed flat and precise. 19 years old and already speaking like someone twice her age who had run out of patience for softening bad news. 11 seconds of contact to bond the relay to their carrier signal. After that, it rides passive. They won't find it unless they physically inspect the housing, and Dominion Signals crews don't do manual sweeps on active broadcast towers. Too much risk of interrupting their own feed. 11 seconds. Kaya had crossed harder ground in less time. She went at full dark, when the plaza's floodlights threw the perimeter fence into stark white glare, and left the ground just beyond it in shadow deep enough to move through if you knew, from 3 days of watching, exactly where the patrol's sightlines didn't overlap. She made it to the tower's base in 4 minutes without being seen. She had the relay bonded to the housing in 9 seconds, 2 under Annan's estimate, and she was already backing into the shadow of the silo's foundation when the second patrol, not the one she'd timed, a new one, a security sweep added after dusk that nobody in the resistance network had known to expect because the Dominion had only started running it tonight, came around the corner of the fence line with a handler and a scent tracking unit that didn't care about sightlines at all. The soldier saw her before the animal did. That was the only reason Kaya was alive to remember it afterward. The half-second of hesitation while a young Corvin trooper, no older by the read of his frame than she was, processed the sight of an armed human 60 meters inside a secured perimeter and reached for his sidearm instead of shouting the alarm first. She put him down before he cleared the holster. The tracking unit screamed, high and mechanical, and every floodlight on the northern perimeter snapped toward the sound. She ran. She did not remember most of the run afterward, only pieces, the fence line blurring past, a second soldier's shot scoring the dirt a meter to her left, the tree line rushing up too slow, and Toma Ferris, 22 years old, one of Okonkwo's 4 remaining fighters, breaking cover from the culvert mouth to lay down suppressing fire that bought her the last 30 meters and cost him. She learned an hour later everything. He'd taken 2 rounds covering her retreat and bled out in the culvert before anyone could get a field dressing on either wound, and Okonkwo had held his hand the whole time and not said a single word, because there was nothing true left to say that wasn't also a lie. Kaya sat against the culvert wall afterward with Annan's relay confirmation chiming faint and green on a cracked tablet screen. Signal bonded, holding, undetected, and did not feel anything she recognized as victory. Toma Ferris had been a grain hauler before the occupation, one of the settlement's dozen or so drivers who ran the harvest routes between the outlying farms and the central silos, a job that had made him, in the peculiar way small colonies sorted their own, one of the few people who knew every family on Halcyon by sight rather than by name alone. He had joined the militia in its first hour, not because he'd ever handled a weapon more serious than a livestock rifle, but because Okonkwo had needed drivers who knew the back roads better than any Dominion tactical map ever would, and Toma had known every one of them, every culvert and drainage cut and blind fold in the land between the silos and the tree line, the same knowledge that had made the culvert position his to hold before anyone else's. He had a sister 2 settlements over who did not yet know, in the hour Kaya sat against that cold wall, that she would spend the rest of the war and a good portion of the peace that followed it carrying a grief she would only ever half explain to people who hadn't lived through it themselves. He knew the odds, Okonkwo said finally into the dark, not looking at her. He asked to run that position, twice. I said no both times. His hand, the one that had held Toma's, was still faintly red. Third time he didn't ask. Des. Don't, he said, not unkindly. Not tonight. Tell me the relay's holding. That's the only thing I can afford to hear right now. It's holding. Then it wasn't for nothing. He said it like a man reciting something he needed to be true rather than something he'd yet confirmed was. Above the tree line, faint and cold, the propaganda banner's blue glow pulsed on. 5,726, 27. The number climbing steady as a heartbeat, while the two of them sat in the dark with a dead man between them and a signal, undetected, riding quiet inside the very tower built to broadcast his killer's triumph. 2 systems over, in a chamber the size of a small moon's crater, floored in polished black stone and ringed by tiered galleries where the delegates of 9 subject worlds sat in silence. The Vanter Assembly convened its emergency session on the Halcyon question, with the particular dread of a body that already suspected what it would decide before the debate began. Ambassador Solène Cray of the human colonial worlds, the last human seat left on the assembly floor, the others having gone dark, one by one, over the 11 prior campaigns, stood at the speaking rail and looked out at 8 species that had all, in one form or another, already surrendered a world to the Ashfall Dominion without firing a shot. You will vote in the next hour on whether to formally recognize the Dominion's sector authority, she said, and her voice did not shake, though everyone in the gallery understood exactly what the vote meant and exactly why it was being taken now tonight, with Halcyon's banner still climbing on every feed in the chamber. You will do this not because you have been defeated in battle. Not one delegate species on this floor has lost a fleet engagement to the Ashfall Dominion in this war. You will do it because a number on a screen has convinced you that resistance costs more than you can bear to pay, and I want it on this assembly's record before the vote that you have never once tested whether that number is true. A Thren delegate, silver-skinned, robed in the deep ochre of the mining consortium worlds, rose from the 3rd tier without waiting to be recognized. Ambassador, with respect, your world is not voting tonight because it has run the numbers and found them wanting. It is losing children by the hour while this chamber debates. Do not lecture the rest of us on courage from behind a podium 4 systems removed from the killing. I'm not lecturing you on courage, Cray said. I am telling you what the killing is for. It was never meant to defeat Halcyon. Halcyon is 11,000 souls on a farming world with no fleet worth the name. Kesari could have taken it in an afternoon with a single cruiser and lost nothing doing it. He is not there for Halcyon. He is there for this chamber. Every name on that tally is a message addressed to you. She let that sit in the black stone silence a moment. The question this assembly should be voting on is not whether Halcyon can be saved tonight. It is whether the rest of you intend to spend the next decade surrendering your worlds one broadcast at a time, on the strength of a number none of you has ever once required him to prove. The Thren delegate did not sit down easily, but he sat. Around the gallery, murmurs moved through the tiers, not agreement, not yet, but something that hadn't been in the room 10 minutes ago, hesitation. It was not much. It would not stop a vote already halfway decided. But Cray had spent 11 campaigns learning that hesitation, in a room built entirely on inevitability, was the only currency that ever moved anything at all. Kesari learned of the breach at the uplink tower 40 minutes after it happened, in the clipped, apologetic report of a security captain who had already run the after-action analysis twice before daring to bring it to him, because bringing an emperor bad news without a clean explanation attached was its own kind of execution risk in the Ashfall Dominion. One intruder, Majesty, neutralized one of our troopers before withdrawing under covering fire. We recovered no device, no evidence of tampering with the relay tower itself. Our engineers ran a full diagnostic, and the uplink is broadcasting clean. Then why, Kesari said, very quietly, in the tone his officers had learned to fear more than shouting, are you standing in front of me telling me about it if there is nothing to tell? The captain's throat worked. Because the intruder had 11 seconds of unsupervised physical contact with the tower housing before the patrol engaged, Majesty, Our engineers cannot rule out a passive device too small for the standard diagnostic sweep to flag. A relay tap. Something riding the carrier signal without altering its output. Kesari looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the captain's quills flattened all the way down against his skull. Then he looked at Yeth, who had been silent through the whole report in the particular way that meant he had already run the calculation and did not like where it landed. "If there is a tap," Kesari said, "what does it cost us?" "Nothing operationally," Yeth said. "The broadcast still reaches its intended audience with its intended framing. A passive relay only means someone, somewhere outside this system, may now also be receiving an unfiltered feed of the ground details actual conduct, not our edited transmission, but raw signal. Faces. Audio the propaganda unit would normally strip." He paused. "It changes nothing about tonight's count, Majesty. It only means that if we are, in fact, being watched by someone we did not choose to show this to, they are seeing it without the framing that has made the tally effective on 10 other worlds." Kesari considered this with the same cold patience he applied to every miscalculation in a campaign that had, until tonight, contained remarkably few of them. "Find the device. Find the intruder. I want both before dawn." "Yes, Majesty." "And Yeth," he did not turn his head, "run me the updated variants on the masking anomaly. I want to know if tonight's intrusion correlates with it." Yeth's hands moved over the console with the practiced economy of 4 decades, and the graph resolved a moment later, the same bell curve, the same anomalous spike at Halcyon rendered now in sharper relief against 11 prior campaigns worth of baseline. "There may be a correlation, Majesty, though I would caution against drawing conclusions from a sample this small. This world's resistance network appears more organized, more willing to accept catastrophic individual risk for marginal strategic gain than any of the previous 10. The intruder tonight killed a trained soldier and extracted under fire rather than surrender or flee blind. That is not the behavior of a population in the terror state our model predicts at this stage of a campaign." "They are afraid," Kesari said. "It was not quite a question." "I have no doubt they are afraid, Majesty. Fear and paralysis are not the same variable, and our model has always conflated them. It assumes fear produces submission because on 10 worlds, across 4 different species, it always has." Yeth's quills twitched, the smallest possible gesture of a man choosing his next words with real care. "Halcyon may be teaching us that the assumption was never a law. Only a correlation that happened to hold 10 times in a row." Kesari said nothing to that for a long while, watching the black feed of the darkened plaza below, the floodlit fence line, the shape of a culvert half a kilometer out where he was quietly certain, without evidence, that his security teams would find nothing at all before dawn. He thought of an elder's hand on a hatchling's shoulder in a colder courtyard 40 years gone, and of the word "be still," and of how long it had taken him to understand that stillness had never once meant the absence of the thing underneath it. "Bring me the file on the girl," he said at last. "The one in your 19%, the one your instruments read strongest." Yeth did not need to ask which file. He had already flagged her twice in his private notes, a 7-year-old designated only by manifest number until Kesari's own translation unit, cross-referencing intercepted colonial communications, had recovered a name. Ren. 9th in tomorrow's queue, Majesty. Biometrics from processing intake show baseline cortisol and catecholamine markers within statistical noise of a resting state. No elevation at all upon separation from her guardian unit, which is, forgive me, Majesty, I have run this comparison 11 times now, unprecedented in the full dataset. Every other subject in 11 campaigns showed measurable stress elevation simply from confinement before any execution proceeding began. Cross it against the other outliers in the 19%, Kesari said. Is the pattern consistent, Or is she simply the strongest single instance of a spread we'd otherwise dismiss as noise? Consistent majesty within the limits of a small sample. I pulled 6 other subjects from Halcyon's intake showing elevated masking scores and reran their intake biometrics against the girls. 4 show the same absence of anticipatory stress response. 2 show a milder version, some elevation, but recovering to baseline faster than any prior campaign's data has ever recorded. I do not have an adequate explanatory variable for any of the 6. Age does not predict it. Sex does not predict it. Proximity to a guardian at time of intake does not predict it, which surprised me most of all, since every other campaign's data shows separation anxiety as the single strongest driver of the fear response we've ever measured. Yeth's quills settled, slow and deliberate, the physical tell of a man forcing himself into complete stillness rather than allowing his own unease to show. If I had to offer a hypothesis I could not yet defend statistically, Majesty, I would say the variable we are missing may not be biological at all. It may be something closer to a belief this population holds about what a name is for, and whether surrendering it costs anything. I do not know how to build that into a model. I am not certain it can be built into one. She is not performing calm, Kesari said slowly, working through it the way he worked through any anomaly, out loud for Yeth's benefit and his own. She is not masking anything. I do not know what she is doing, Majesty. I only know what the instruments are recording, and the instruments have never lied to me before tonight. Kesari rose from the command cradle for the first time in 6 hours, and stood at the transparent forward bulkhead looking down at a darkened plaza he had already, in the coldest part of his mind, decided to visit in person. Then tomorrow, he said, I will read her myself. Instruments can be wrong about a great many things. Eyes have never once been wrong about anything, in 40 years, that I did not eventually see for what it was. Yeth said nothing. He logged the decision as his function required, and did not write down the small, private thought that followed it, that in 40 years of service, he had never once heard his emperor describe an anomaly as something to solve rather than something to eliminate, and that the difference, however small, felt to him like the first crack he had ever seen in a wall he had long ago stopped believing could crack at all. Dawn came gray and low over Halcyon, and with it, a Dominion security sweep that pushed a full company through the tree line in a search pattern too disciplined to be anything but a genuine hunt for whoever had put a hand on their tower 12 hours earlier. Kaya watched them come from a fallback position Okonkwo had scouted 2 days prior against exactly this contingency. A drainage cistern half-collapsed under an old grain silo, too small to stand in, cold enough that by the second hour she had stopped feeling her feet. Anand crouched beside her with the cracked tablet dimmed to its lowest brightness, watching a single green indicator that meant, as far as either of them could tell, that the relay was still bonded, still passive, still riding the Dominion's own signal out past the system's edge toward whatever was left to receive it. They're not finding it, she whispered, more to herself than to Kaya. They're looking at the tower. It's not on the tower anymore, it's in the tower's own broadcast stream. You can't find a passenger by searching the train station. Can they find us instead? Anand didn't answer that, which was its own answer. The search company passed within 40 meters of the cistern twice in 3 hours and found nothing, because Okonkwo had built this position with his own hands over 2 days, and knew exactly which sounds an old irrigation system made on its own and exactly which ones a hiding human made. And he had drilled that difference into every fighter left under his command, with the patience of a man who had buried enough of them already to take drilling seriously. By mid-morning, the company withdrew toward the plaza, and Kaya allowed herself to breathe again, and did not allow herself to feel anything like relief, because relief was a currency she'd stopped being able to afford 3 days ago. The relay held. Somewhere past the edge of the system, on a receiver Kaya would never see and a screen she would never watch it play across, Raw, unfiltered footage of a Dominion execution site was arriving now, uncut, unedited, unclaimed by any propaganda unit's careful framing. And though she didn't know it yet, crouched cold and cramping in a collapsed cistern with a dead man's absence still sitting heavy in her chest. That footage had already reached the Vanter Assembly's emergency feed 40 minutes before the vote Ambassador Cray had been fighting to delay, and had bought, with nothing but its own unedited existence, exactly the kind of hesitation a chamber full of surrendering species had not felt in 11 campaigns. She did not know this. She only knew the plaza was still there, the banner was still climbing, and the day's queue would resume the moment the search company reported back that the site was secure. It resumed at noon. Kaya watched it from the roofline again, back at her post because there was nowhere else useful to be, and because Wren was still ninth from a line that had shortened by 14, and then grown again as new intake arrived from a neighboring settlement the Dominion had swept overnight. The number that mattered was never really the queue's length, only the tallies, and the tally did not care how many children it had left to draw from. 5,727. A boy named, she would learn the name later, from a survivor's testimony logged months afterward, because in the moment she only had a face and a small blue jacket, and a manifest number she refused to remember as a number. Walked to the platform steady on his own feet, and answered the first 2 questions in a voice too young to hold as level as it did. And when the ground overseer asked whether he understood why this was happening, he looked, for 1 full second, directly up into the recording drone's lens instead of at the overseer's face, and said nothing at all until the 4 seconds elapsed. 5,728. A girl older, maybe 13, who did cry openly, and whose tears changed nothing about the timeline, because the overseer's protocol had never once in 11 worlds allowed a child's tears to alter the 4-second window, and Kaya understood in that moment with a clarity that felt like something breaking loose in her chest that the protocol was the horror, more than any single execution. The fact that it did not matter whether you were afraid or brave, whether you begged or stayed silent, whether you cried or held Wren's terrible paper-cut stillness, because the 4 seconds ran the same length regardless, and the number climbed the same amount regardless, and nothing any single child did on that platform had ever once, on 10 worlds before this one, changed the outcome by a single second. 5,729. Kaya's earpiece was silent. Okonkwo had ordered radio discipline for the duration of the day's processing, not out of caution but because, he'd told her flatly that morning, there was nothing useful left to say to each other while it happened, and he would not waste her concentration on words that couldn't change anything. She understood. She kept watching anyway because someone had to, because Priya Anand's little green light needed a witness feeding it context even if the witness could do nothing but watch, and because some old, stubborn part of her believed without evidence, against every hour of the last 3 days, that watching mattered, that it was different somehow from looking away. 5,730. One more. The propaganda drone's banner flickered, recalculated, held. Below on the platform, a soldier called the next name off the manifest, and Kaya's whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the cistern's lingering chill, because the name called was not Wren's, a boy, younger, 5 or 6, from the new overnight intake, a child whose face she had never seen until this moment and whose name she would spend the rest of her life unable to forget. And some small, disgusting, human part of her felt something horribly close to relief, and hated herself for it instantly, completely, the way you hate a reflex you cannot uninstall. The boy did not walk steady. He was carried, screaming, by a soldier who held him the way you'd hold something you were trying not to look directly at, and the overseer asked his 3 questions to a child too young and too terrified to answer any of them. And the 4 seconds ran anyway, because the 4 seconds always ran, and Kaya watched the number complete its long climb from the roofline of a building 3 days into an occupation that had already outlasted every measure of endurance she'd believed herself capable of. 5,731. The banner froze. Then, across the plaza, across every screen the Dominion's sector-wide broadcast reached, it began to pulse, not the cold blue update rhythm of an ongoing count, but a wide gold border, ceremonial, triumphant, the visual signature the HFY propaganda unit reserved for exactly one kind of announcement. And Kaya understood, watching it bloom across the drone's projection with a horror that had run out of new registers to feel. That the number the resistance network had never been able to name had just, finally, been reached. And down on the command platform, visible now on the drone's wide-angle feed for the first time in 3 days of processing, because Emperor Dravan Kesari of the HFY Dominion had, until this moment, watched every execution from orbit and never once set foot on the ground of a world he was conquering. A tall gray figure in ceremonial black stepped up beside the overseer, looked out over 600 kneeling colonists and a queue of children not yet processed, and laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, not the way Kaya had imagined it in 3 days of picturing this exact man's face without ever having seen it. It was quiet, almost pleasant. The laugh of a man satisfied by the completion of a long and difficult piece of work, the way an engineer might laugh at the closing readout of a bridge that had finally, after years, borne its rated load without failing. That was somehow worse. Kesari's laugh faded into something quieter, more contained, and he lifted one hand, a small gesture, economical, the same gesture that had ended 3 surrenders before a single shot was fired, and the ground overseer halted the queue mid-motion, the next soldier freezing with his hand still on a child's shoulder, waiting. Sector broadcast confirmed at threshold majesty, came a voice over the platform's comm, tinny with distance, one of the signal's officers relaying from the command cruiser above. Propaganda unit is packaging the milestone transmission now. Projected saturation across all 11 prior campaign systems within the hour. Hold further processing, Kesari said, and something in the plaza seemed to exhale. 600 colonists still kneeling, still bound, but the machinery that had been grinding through their children for 3 days had, for the first time, actually stopped. The tally is complete. There is no operational value in continuing beyond it. He said this the way he said most things, flat, administrative, a man reading a conclusion off a spreadsheet rather than announcing mercy, because he would not have called it mercy, and Kaya, watching from the roof line, disbelieving, her whole body coiled tight around a hope she didn't trust, understood, even from that distance, that he meant every cold, bloodless word of it. 31 children still stood in the queue. They would live. That single fact detonated through her chest with a force that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with the particular, specific horror of a killing machine that measured its own restraint in exactly the same clinical units it measured its cruelty, because he had not spared them. He had simply run out of use for them. "Bring me the girl," Kesari said next, to the ground overseer, and Kaya's hope curdled instantly back into cold, because she knew, before the overseer even checked the manifest, exactly which girl he meant. They brought Ren to the platform not as the 5,732nd name on a completed tally, but as something else entirely, a specimen, walked forward under Kesari's own direct instruction, while the rest of the queue stood frozen, spared, watching. Kaya saw her cousin's yellow coat cross the last few meters of open ground toward the platform's steel edge, saw her stop where the soldier's hand released her shoulder, saw her stand there alone in front of the tallest, coldest figure Kaya had ever laid eyes on, and had to bite down hard enough on the inside of her own cheek to taste blood to keep from making a sound that would have ended every single thing she had bled and lost and killed a man to protect over the last 3 days. "Raise," Akonkwohale's voice finally breaking radio discipline, a whisper in her ear, "talk to me." He stopped the queue, she breathed. He's he's got Ren, alone, on the platform. He's not reading it off a slate, he's standing in front of her himself. A long pause. Fleet Command just burst transmitted an update, Okonkwo Hale said, and his voice had gone strange, tight, careful, the way it went when he was holding something back that he didn't fully believe yet. The Assembly's emergency session picked up Annan's relay feed 40 minutes into the vote. Cray played it raw, unedited, on the chamber floor. There's a Thren border patrol group, light, 6 vessels, nothing that beats 3 Corving cruisers in a straight fight, that broke formation on their own commander's order the second the footage hit their relay and burned every reserve they had redlining toward this system. They're not 4 days out anymore, Rays. Something in his voice cracked, just slightly, just once. They're 11 minutes. 11 minutes. Kaya looked back down at the platform, at Ren standing small and still and steady in front of a man who had, 3 hours ago, laughed at the completion of 5,731 deaths, and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that whatever was about to happen on that platform was going to happen in a window measured in minutes. Not enough time for a fleet still burning hard across open space. Not enough time for anything but whatever Ren herself did or didn't do in the next handful of seconds. And that there was nothing, nothing at all, that Kaya could do from a rooftop 80 meters out to change a single part of it. She kept watching. It was, in the end, the only thing she had left to give. Kesari studied the girl for a long moment before he spoke, the way he studied anything he intended to understand rather than merely process, and found, in that first close look, exactly what Yeth's instruments had already told him he would find, and exactly what 40 years of reading eyes had never once prepared him to actually see. She was small, younger than most of the others he'd watched cross this kind of platform, 7 years old by the file, dressed in a yellow coat gone dull with 3 days of dust, her hands not bound. He had ordered the restraints removed from children under 10 after the second campaign, a small mercy that cost him nothing and had, he told himself at the time, made the process more humane, though he had never once examined what humane meant when it modified a process that ended the same way regardless. Her hair was dark and cut short and pushed back from her face by a hand that was, he noticed, not shaking. Her breathing was even. Her shoulders were not drawn up around her ears the way every other child's had been, on this platform and 10 others, in the last moments before the question started. He looked at her eyes. He had looked at 11,000 pairs of eyes across 11 campaigns, and had never once failed to find the tell, the flicker, the widening, the flat glassy shock that meant a mind had gone somewhere else, because the body could no longer bear to stay present for what was happening to it. He had built an empire on the reliability of that flicker. He looked for it now with the same patient, practiced attention he had given every subject before her, certain, in the deep, unexamined part of himself that had never once been wrong, that he would find it within the 4 seconds his own protocol allotted. He did not find it. Her eyes were brown and steady, and looking directly back at him without flinching, without performing anything at all, not defiance, which he would have recognized instantly. Defiance had its own tell, its own tight jaw and locked breath, not the masking calm his own elder had taught him 40 years ago in a colder courtyard, which he could read through in a heartbeat because he had lived inside that particular performance himself and knew every seam of it from the inside. This was neither. This was simply a small girl looking at a very tall stranger with an attention that held no visible fear in it at all. And Kesari, who had never once in his adult life failed to locate the thing he was looking for in another creature's face, felt something in his chest go quiet and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the plaza's temperature. "Designation," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected, the ritual question doing what rituals were for, carrying a man through the moments his own mind wasn't ready to occupy. "Ren," she said. Not a number. Not a manifest code, not a settlement of origin recited by rote the way the older children sometimes manage through their fear, not a whimper or a scream or a plea directed past him toward whatever adult still stood in the kneeling rows behind her. A name. Her own name, given plainly, the way you might give it to a new teacher on the first day of a school year. A small, ordinary fact offered without weight because to her, Kesari understood with a lurch he could not immediately name. It was simply true, and true things did not require fear to be spoken. Settlement of origin, he said, and heard distantly that his voice had lost some of its steadiness on the second question, though he could not have said why. North Grain Settlement, Ren said. By the silos. A pause, small, unhurried. My mom's back there in the kneeling part. She told me to tell you my name clear so you'd remember it. Another pause, and here, finally, Kesari's 40 years of reading found something, though it was not the thing he had spent 40 years learning to find. Not fear. Something else entirely, something he did not have a category for in any of his careful models, something that looked, absurdly, almost like patience, the way you're patient with someone slow to understand an obvious thing. She said you probably don't remember most of them, the names, because there's a lot. Kesari did not answer that. He could not, in the moment, have said why not, except that some deep structural piece of the architecture he had built himself into over 4 decades had just taken a weight it was never designed to bear, and had not yet finished discovering that it would not hold. Do you understand? He said, and his own protocol's third question came out of him now like something recited from very far away. Why this is happening? And Ren looked at him, not around him, not down at the platform, not back toward the kneeling rows where her mother waited, but directly at him, into the exact place behind his eyes where he had spent 40 years locating other people's terror, and had never once had to locate his own, and said, simply, without cruelty, without triumph, in the flat, unweighted voice of a child stating, a fact she had clearly already worked out for herself in 3 long days of watching this exact ritual happen to 31 other children before her. You're scared of something, I don't know what, but it's not us. The 4 seconds ran out. Kesari did not move. He did not give the small economical gesture that had ended 11 campaigns, did not nod to the soldier at his shoulder, did not do any of the 1,000 small administrative things his own protocol required of him in this exact moment. Because, for the first time in 40 years of reading faces for a living, Emperor Dravan Kesari of the Ashfall Dominion had found, in the eyes of a 7-year-old girl in a dust-dulled yellow coat, absolutely nothing that he recognized. And the not recognizing had reached backward through every carefully built year of his life, and found the one thing underneath all of it that he had never once let anyone see. A hatchling in a cold courtyard, an elder's hand gripping his shoulder hard enough to bruise, and a stillness that had never, not for one single second of 40 years, actually been the absence of fear. The recording drone hovering at the overseer's shoulder caught all of it, every second, and carried live across a sector-wide broadcast that had, 40 minutes earlier, declared its own triumphant threshold complete. 11 prior campaign systems, and every delegate on the Vanter assembly floor watched, in real time, the architect of their surrender stand motionless and silent in front of an unarmed child for 4 seconds. And then 5. And then 6. Unable to give an order his own protocol had never once, in 11 campaigns, required him to think twice about giving. Overseer Yeth Kalraman, watching the same feed from the command cruiser above with 40 years of institutional loyalty suddenly, quietly, irrevocably reorganizing itself around a single new data point, did not say a word. He simply stopped recording the tally, closed the file, and for the first time in his career, opened a different one. The first Thren interceptor broke atmosphere 11 minutes and 6 seconds after Okonkwo-Hale's whispered countdown began, streaking down through Halcyon's thin cloud cover in a burn so hot it left a visible scar of ionized air behind it. and every soldier on the plaza floor who was not staring at their emperor's unbroken, impossible silence looked up at the sky instead. Kaya felt it before she understood what it was, a pressure change. A low bone-deep thrum that meant something large and fast had just entered the atmosphere at a speed no shuttle used for routine transit. And then the plaza's floodlights guttered as the command cruiser in orbit above began rerouting power to point defense. And the ground detail's disciplined administrative rhythm, 3 days unbroken, finally, completely, shattered. "Raise, that's our window," Okonkwo Hale's voice, urgent now, all radio discipline abandoned. "Whatever you're going to do, do it now, while their whole security posture is looking up instead of out." She was already moving. 80 meters of open ground had killed a man 12 hours earlier, but the ground detail that had held that perimeter with lethal, patient discipline for 3 days was no longer holding anything. Soldiers breaking formation to check comms, to look skyward, to receive orders from officers who had never once in this campaign needed to issue an order under actual fire, and were discovering in real time that they did not have one ready. Kaya went over the fence line at a dead run and did not look at the second interceptor screaming past overhead toward an engagement with the command cruiser that would decide, in the next 4 minutes, whether Halcyon Sky belonged to anyone at all, because looking at it would not get her to run any faster. On the platform, Kesari had still not moved. Overseer Yeth had. He had come down from the command cruiser himself in the last 90 seconds of the countdown, some old loyalty finally overridden by something he did not yet have a name for, and reached the platform's edge just as the plaza's ground detail began, in ragged, uncoordinated pockets, to break toward defensive positions that made no tactical sense against an orbital engagement they had no way to influence. "Majesty," Yeth's voice close now, low, urgent in a register Kesari had never once heard from him in 40 years. "Majesty, we are under attack. I need an order." Kesari did not look at him. He was still looking at Ren, who had not moved either, who stood on the platform's steel edge with the same unhurried, unweighted patience she had shown through all 3 of his questions, watching him the way you might watch someone slowly working out a math problem you'd already solved yourself, in no particular hurry for them to catch up. "Majesty," Yeth's hand, trembling slightly, closed on his emperor's arm, a violation of 40 years of protocol that neither of them in the moment registered as one. "I need an order. Our cruiser's point defense is engaged. Ground forces have no coordinated posture. If you do not give an instruction in the next 30 seconds, this detail will make its own decisions, and I do not trust what those decisions will be with a child standing between an untrained soldier and an active threat." Something in that reached him. Kesari blinked, the first involuntary motion he had made since the 4-second window had elapsed, and for one fractured instant, the 2 images occupying his mind collided. A girl in a yellow coat telling him he was afraid of something that wasn't her, and 40 years of a discipline built entirely on never once letting that sentence be true. "Fall back to the cruiser's landing perimeter," he said, and his voice came out rough, unfamiliar to his own ears, a voice he had not used since he was young enough to still be afraid of things out loud. "All ground units, defensive posture only, no engagement with the colonial population." He looked finally away from Ren, toward the overseer whose hand was still on his arm. "Get the girl back to the kneeling rows, to her mother." A pause, and something in his face that Yeth, reading, faces himself now, for the first time in his career, instead of only data, would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately to anyone who asked. "Do not process anyone else today, Yeth. Not while I am on this world." It was not an order his propaganda unit could have scripted, not a phrase that fit any doctrine his statisticians had ever modeled. And it was, Yeth understood with a clarity that arrived like cold water, the single most honest sentence his emperor had spoken aloud in the 4 decades he had served him. Kaya reached the platform 90 seconds later, breathless, weapon drawn on instinct, though there was no one left near Ren to point it at, and found her cousin standing exactly where the soldier had released her, unhurt, uncrying, watching the chaos of a collapsing security perimeter with the same steady, unflinching patience she had shown a tyrant. Ren. Kaya's voice cracked on the single syllable in a way 3 days of grief and adrenaline had somehow not managed until this exact moment. She crossed the last 10 meters and dropped to her knees and pulled the girl into her arms hard enough to bruise, and Ren let her, finally, folding into it the way a 7-year-old was supposed to, small and shaking now that there was someone safe to shake in front of. "He didn't do anything," Ren said, muffled against Kaya's shoulder, and it took Kaya a moment to understand she wasn't asking a question, only reporting a fact she was still working out the shape of. "He was going to. I could tell." And then he just stopped. "I know," Kaya said, though she didn't, not really, not yet, not the specific reason, only the fact of it, the impossible fact of a queue halted and an emperor frozen and a girl walking away from that platform breathing. "I know, sweetheart. You did so good. You did so good." Above them, in a sky now streaked with the burning wreckage of a Corvin point defense grid, overwhelmed by 6 Thren interceptors that had broken formation on nothing but the strength of raw footage and a single officer's conscience, the command cruiser that had watched over 3 days of Halcyon's execution queue began, for the first time in the campaign, to fall back. The fighting, such as it was, lasted 11 more minutes and never once touched the plaza itself. The Thren interceptors had not come to liberate Halcyon by force. 6 light vessels against 3 Corvin cruisers was not a fight anyone sane would choose, and their commander, a weathered officer named Rhett Ilving, who would later tell the story 100 times and never once tire of it, had burned his squadron's entire reserve on a single calculated bet. That a command structure caught mid-collapse, its emperor frozen on an open broadcast in front of a sector-wide audience, would not have the coordination left to mount a real defense in the 90 seconds it took to matter. He was right. The lead Corvin cruiser took 2 hits to its point defense grid before its captain, receiving no clear orders from a command deck that had spent the last 4 minutes arguing about whether the Emperor's stand-down instructions superseded standing combat doctrine, made the decision himself to break orbit rather than risk further engagement without direction. The other 2 followed. It was not a victory in any sense a military historian would later describe as decisive. 6 interceptors did not defeat 3 cruisers, could not have, would have been annihilated in a straight engagement that ran even another 90 seconds, but they did not need to win the fight. They only needed to hold the sky long enough for the sight of them holding it, broadcast alongside everything else the day had already shown the sector, to finish the work the footage of a frozen emperor had already started. On the ground, the withdrawal order Kesari had given reached the last scattered ground units within minutes, and Halcyon's militia, 4 fighters left, one of them a 19-year-old signals tech who had never fired a weapon in her life until that morning, watched Dominion troopers fall back toward their landing craft in a retreat too orderly to be called a rout, and too fast to be called anything else. Kaya stayed on her knees on the platform with Ren in her arms until Akonquohale reached them, moving faster than a man with one arm in a sling should have been able to move, and the sound he made when he saw both of them alive and unhurt was not a word at all, just breath, released all at once, the sound of 3 days finally letting go of a weight he had never once let show on his face. "She's fine," Kaya said before he could ask, her voice cracking again on the second word. "Des, she's fine, he just stopped." "I don't know why he stopped. I don't care why he stopped, she's fine." Akonquohale knelt beside them both and put his good hand on Ren's small back, and for a long moment none of them said anything at all, because the plaza around them had gone strange and quiet in the particular way. A space goes quiet after violence has finally, actually ended rather than merely paused. 600 colonists still kneeling, some of them beginning, tentatively, to look up, to look around. to understand in pieces that the soldiers standing over them had received an order to stop and had, against every pattern of the last 3 days, actually stopped. Priya Anand found them 20 minutes later, tablet clutched against her chest, tears streaking clean tracks down a face that had not cried once in 3 days of building a relay under threat of execution. "It worked," she said, and her voice was wrecked, half laugh and half sob. "Kaya, it worked. The whole sector saw it. The assembly saw it live." Cray played it on the chamber floor while the vote was still open, and 6 delegates rescinded their surrender in real time. It's everywhere now. It's on every relay in range. Everyone's seen it. Everyone saw him just standing there." "I know," Kaya said, though she hadn't known, not the scale of it, not yet, and would not fully understand for days what a single passive relay bonded to a propaganda tower for 11 seconds had actually set in motion across 9 subject worlds, and an assembly floor 2 systems away. She looked down at Ren, still curled against her, finally, quietly asleep in the exhausted, boneless way children sleep after fear finally has somewhere safe to land. "I know it did." Above them, the last visible trace of the Corvin cruiser's burn faded from the gray morning sky, and the plaza's propaganda drone, still hovering, still recording. Apparently no one left in the retreating chain of command had thought to recall it. Continued broadcasting to a sector audience of billions the image of 600 colonists rising slowly, unsteadily to their feet, no longer kneeling, no longer bound. Standing in a square that 3 hours earlier had held a machine built to prove that fear, applied correctly, always won. It had not won. It had, for the first time in 11 campaigns, simply stopped. In the Vanter Assembly's crater chamber, the vote that had been half decided before it opened collapsed entirely in the 11 minutes. It took the raw feed from Priya Anand's relay to run its full, unedited length across the chamber's central projection. Ambassador Solen Cray had not planned to show it. She had intended, when she rose to speak against the surrender motion, to argue the point the way she had argued it on 10 prior occasions, and lost on 10 prior occasions. With reason, with precedent, with the cold mathematics of casualties averted versus sovereignty surrendered. And she had lost every one of those arguments to a number on a screen that no delegate present had ever once required anyone to prove. She had not expected, 40 minutes into the session, for her aide to burst onto the chamber floor with a data slate and a signal intercept that had not existed an hour earlier, carrying footage that no Dominion propaganda unit had authorized and no framing had softened. She played it without asking permission, because she had run out of patience for asking permission for anything. The chamber watched, in total silence, 600 kneeling colonists and a queue of children and a laugh that was not cruel so much as satisfied, an engineer's laugh at a bridge finally bearing its load. And then, without any editing, without any cut, the same feed continued into a moment no assembly delegate present had ever imagined they would witness. The architect of 11 campaigns worth of surrender standing motionless, silent, unable to complete a ritual he had performed without hesitation 11,000 times before, undone by nothing more than a 7-year-old girl telling him his own name. The Thren delegate who had spoken against Cray 40 minutes earlier was the first to break the silence, and when he did, his voice had lost every trace of the certainty it had carried before. "That is not a performance," he said quietly, to no one in particular. Staring at the frozen frame the chamber's projection had hung in the air above the floor, Kesari's face, caught mid-stillness, eyes fixed on something the camera angle didn't show. "I have watched 11 campaigns of footage from this man's propaganda unit. I have never once seen his face do that." "No one has," Cray said. "That's the point I've been making for 11 campaigns, delegate. You have surrendered 9 worlds to a number, and none of you has ever once asked whether the man behind the number could actually survive being questioned by it." The vote, when it finally ran, failed by a margin so wide it did not require a recount. Not merely a rejection of the Dominion sector authority, but a formal assembly resolution, drafted and passed within the hour on a wave of momentum no single delegate could have manufactured alone, condemning the tally doctrine by name and authorizing every subject world watching the broadcast to consider its prior surrender void. It was not a declaration of war. The Vanter Assembly had no fleet to declare one with. It was something quieter and, in the long run, more dangerous to the Ashfall Dominion than any single battle could have been. Permission, sector-wide, for 11 prior campaign worlds to stop believing the story that had conquered them without a shot fired. Within 6 hours, 3 of those worlds' governing councils rescinded their surrender orders. Within a day, 2 more followed. The Dominion's terror doctrine, built over 4 decades on the single unexamined premise that fear scaled indefinitely once demonstrated decisively enough, had run for the first time into a demonstration that had gone the other way on a live broadcast in front of everyone it was meant to control. And premises, once broken in public, did not repair themselves quietly. Aboard the Ashfall flagship Morning Star, fleeing Halcyon orbit at a burn rate its own engineers would later describe as undignified, Emperor Dravan Kesari sat alone in his private cabin for the first time in 4 decades without giving a single order, and did not move, for a very long while at all. Overseer Yeth found him there 3 hours after the withdrawal, having spent those 3 hours doing something he had never once done in 40 years of service. Reviewing his own tally data not as an instrument of policy but as evidence, cross-referencing every campaign's biometric readings against the model's founding assumptions, building, quietly, without authorization, in a private file he had begun keeping the moment he stopped recording, a case he did not yet have a name for but understood, with the particular clarity of a statistician finally allowed to see his own numbers honestly, that he intended to finish. Majesty. He stood in the cabin doorway a long moment before Kesari acknowledged him. The High Command Council has convened an emergency session. They are requesting your presence within the hour. I know what they're requesting, Kesari said, without turning. His voice had not fully recovered the register it had carried before the platform. Something in it had stayed low, rough, unfamiliar, the way a room sounds different after a wall inside it has come down. They are requesting an explanation for why their emperor stood in front of a sector-wide broadcast and could not give an order for 11 seconds. Yes, Majesty. Do you have one for them, Yeth? You have spent 40 years explaining my decisions to people who did not understand them. I find I would like to hear how you explain this one. Yeth was quiet for a moment, choosing the words with the same careful precision he had chosen every report of his career, except that for the first time, he was not choosing them to protect the man he was reporting to. I would tell them the truth, Majesty, if you would permit it, that our model was built on a single flawed premise we mistook, for 4 decades, for a law. That fear, demonstrated decisively enough, always produces submission. That premise held on 10 worlds and 4 species, and every time it held, we recorded the result as confirmation rather than coincidence. It failed on the 11th, not because the demonstration was insufficiently decisive. Because the population we tested it against did not process the demonstration the way our model assumed all populations must. He paused. A 7-year-old child did not perform fear for you, Majesty, because she was not afraid, and I do not believe, having reviewed every biometric reading we recorded across 3 days, that any child on that world was ever performing anything at all. I believe humans simply do not process the imminence of death the way our model requires them to. And I believe, further, that this council will not survive learning that the doctrine we sold them as an unbreakable law of galactic conquest was, in fact, an untested assumption that happened to hold 10 times before it didn't. Kesari turned, finally, to look at him, and there was something in his face Yeth had genuinely never seen there before in 4 decades. Not anger, not the cold administrative displeasure that preceded every consequence his officers had learned to fear. Something closer to exhaustion, Something closer, though Yeth would not have dared say the word aloud to relief. Then tell them the truth, Kesari said, all of it. Whatever it costs. Majesty, they will remove you from the throne for this. I know. They may do worse than remove you. I know that too. Kesari looked past him, out through the cabin's narrow viewport at the receding curve of a world he had spent 3 days trying to break and had, in the end, only proven something about himself instead. I have spent 40 years believing that stillness was strength, Yeth, that the hatchling who learns to hide what he feels survives, and the one who doesn't, and that this was simply how the universe was built. I built an empire on teaching that lesson to everyone else, at the point of a weapon, on world after world, and I called it strategy. His voice dropped lower still. A little girl looked at me today and told me I was afraid of something, and she was right, and she did not need to hide anything at all to say it, and I have not in 4 decades ever once met a creature who could do that. I do not know what that means about humans. I know exactly what it means about me. He stood slowly, an old weariness in the motion that had nothing to do with his physical age. Tell them the truth. I would like, for once in my life, to see what happens when the number is finally allowed to be wrong in front of everyone who believed it. The High Command Tribunal convened 4 hours later, and Emperor Dravan Kesari of the Ashfall Dominion, ruler of 11 conquered systems, architect of a terror doctrine that had ended more wars without invasion than any strategy in 3 centuries of Corvin military history, stood before it, and told them everything Yeth had told him, in his own words, without softening a single line of it, and did not resist when the council's ranking general, a hard, ambitious woman named Sela Vorik, who had wanted the throne for a decade, and had never once had a lever strong enough to take it, moved within the hour. To have him formally relieved of command, pending a full tribunal review. He did not fight the vote. Some part of him, the part that had spent 4 hours alone in a cabin finally looking directly at 40 years of scar tissue, understood that he had already lost the thing that had held the throne together far more completely than any council vote could take from him, and that there was, in the end, a strange and unfamiliar peace in finally putting the weight down. The Free World's fleet's main task group reached Halcyon orbit 9 hours after the interceptor squadron had first broken atmosphere, arriving not to a battle, but to a system already quiet, its remaining Dominion presence reduced to a scattering of ground personnel who surrendered without incident to the first shuttle that landed, no longer certain, in the absence of clear orders from a command structure 3 hours into its own collapse, what exactly they were supposed to be defending. Kaya stood at the edge of the plaza when the first Free World's transport touched down, Ren's small hand wrapped tight in hers, and watched human soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms step down onto ground that 3 days earlier had held a machine built specifically to convince worlds like this one that no rescue would ever come in time. A young officer, not much older than she was, crossed the open ground toward her with the particular careful gait of someone who had seen the raw footage on the way in, and did not yet trust his own composure to hold if he moved too fast. Corporal Reyes, he said her name like he already knew it, which unsettled her more than she expected. Fleet Commands had your relay feed running on every briefing screen in the task group since it hit our uplink. Signals officer wants to shake the hand of whoever built the tap. Command wants to shake the hand of whoever planted it. He looked down briefly at Ren, and something in his professional composure softened despite himself. And about 600 million people across 9 systems want to know the name of the girl who made an emperor stop talking. She doesn't want that, Kaya said, quiet, protective, an instinct that had crystallized somewhere in the last 3 days into something she suspected would never fully soften again. She's 7. She wants to go home and sleep in her own bed, and not be asked about any of it for a very long time. The officer nodded, and to his credit did not argue the point, though Kaya understood, watching the fleet's field cameras already sweeping the plaza, cataloging, documenting, that the world was not going to be quite that generous with Ren's privacy, no matter how fiercely Kaya meant to guard it. That was a fight for another day. Today there were wounded to tend, and 600 colonists still blinking in the light of a freedom none of them had let themselves believe in until the moment it actually arrived, and a dead man in a culvert who deserved, at minimum, a name spoken aloud in front of people who understood exactly what he traded for 11 minutes. Okonkwo organized that himself that evening in the plaza's ruined market square, with what was left of Halcyon's militia standing in a loose half-circle around a single burned marker, driven into the dirt where Toma Ferris's name had been carved with a field knife because there had been no time, in 3 days of running, for anything more formal. He asked to hold that position twice, Okonkwo said to the small crowd that had gathered, his voice steady in a way Kaya understood cost him everything he had left to spend on steadiness that day. I told him no both times because I did not want to be the man who let a 22-year-old die buying 11 seconds for a relay tap that might not even work. He asked a third time anyway, and he did not ask me. He told me. And because of what he bought with those 11 seconds, there are 31 children on this world tonight who are not on a tally that will never now be broadcast as a victory to anyone. He paused, and his jaw worked once before he continued. I will not stand here and tell you his death made sense, because it didn't, because nothing about the last 3 days made sense, and I have buried enough people in this war to know that grief doesn't care whether the math worked out in the end. But the math did work out. He is the reason it worked out. I want that said out loud once by someone who was there, before the fleet's official record turns it into a line in a report. Nobody spoke for a long while after that. Ren, still holding Kaya's hand, looked up at the marker in the dirt with the same steady, unhurried attention she had turned on an emperor 12 hours earlier, and said, quietly, in a voice too young to carry the weight of what it was saying and somehow carrying it anyway, "Thank you for the 11 seconds." It was, Kaya thought later, the only eulogy that mattered, and the shortest one anyone gave that night. 2 systems away, in a modest apartment 3 floors above a resettlement processing center, on a Thren mining world that had surrendered to the Dominion's terror doctrine 4 campaigns before Halcyon, and never once tested whether the surrender had been necessary. An old miner named Old Kor Vashton sat in front of a public relay screen with his grandchildren gathered around him and watched, for the 11th time that day, the footage of a small human girl telling an emperor his own name. He had been a young man during his own world's surrender, one of the 6% his own governing council had privately, shamefully, called cowards for arguing against fighting a fleet nobody had actually engaged, and he had carried that word for 4 decades without ever having a way to answer it, because the surrender had been bloodless, and bloodless surrenders did not leave scars anyone else could see, only the ones that stayed inside. She wasn't performing anything, he said to his eldest granddaughter, who worked signals for the mining consortium's small defense auxiliary, and had brought him the footage that morning still shaking from having watched it live on the relay feeds. I know what performing comm looks like, girl. I performed it myself 40 years ago in front of officers who never once asked me a question because our council surrendered before it came to that. I have wondered every day since whether I would have broken if they had. He watched the frozen frame of Kesari's face, motionless, unable to complete a ritual that had ended his own world's resistance without a single shot fired. This is not what fear held very quietly looks like. I know that look. I have worn that look. That is a child who was simply never afraid, and I do not understand it, and I do not think I need to understand it to know it means something about what we surrendered without ever once making them prove they could win. His granddaughter did not answer him directly. She simply opened a secure channel to the mining consortium's Defense Auxiliary Command, the first message of its kind sent from that world in 4 campaigns, and began, quietly, the long administrative work of finding out whether her grandfather's shame and her own anger might together add up to something the Dominion's collapsing terror doctrine could no longer afford to ignore. She was not alone. Across 9 subject worlds that week, in apartments and barracks and council chambers and shipyards, the same footage played on an uncountable number of screens, and the same quiet, private reckoning played out in an uncountable number of rooms. Not a galaxy rising up in a single coordinated uprising, nothing so clean or so fast, but something slower and, in its way, more durable. A story that had held 9 worlds still for 4 decades finally being tested by the people it had governed, and finding, world by world, that it did not survive the testing. The formal tribunal convened on the Ashfall Dominion's home shipyard station 3 weeks later, in a chamber built for ceremony rather than justice. Its High Command Council, seated in tiered galleries, not unlike the Vanter Assembly's own. And Overseer Yeth Cowraman stood at the evidence rail with 40 years of institutional data compiled into a single testimony. He had rewritten 11 times in 3 weeks, trying and failing each time to make it sound less damning than it actually was. General Sela Vorik presided, newly installed, her ascension to interim command still fresh enough that half the gallery watched her with the particular careful neutrality of officers waiting to see which way the political weather would actually break before committing to a position. She had wanted this chair for a decade. She had not expected to inherit it during the collapse of the single doctrine that had made the chair worth wanting. "State your findings, Overseer," she said, and her voice carried none of Kesari's old economy, none of the quiet certainty that had once made a room stop arguing the instant he spoke. She was still learning the register. Yeth suspected, watching her, that she would spend years learning it and never quite manage the thing Kesari had done without effort, because the thing Kesari had done without effort had, in the end, been built on exactly the wound he'd shown, once on a platform in front of the whole sector, and Vorik did not carry that particular wound, and would build her rule on something else instead, cruder probably, and in its own way easier to break. "My findings are these," Yeth said, and made himself say them plainly, the way he had promised himself in a cabin on the Morning Star 3 weeks ago that he would say them, whatever it cost. The tally doctrine was built on a single statistical assumption never once formally tested, that documented, broadcast terror produces submission at a predictable, scaling rate across any subject population, given sufficient demonstration. This assumption held across 10 campaigns and 4 species. It failed on the 11th, catastrophically, in front of a sector-wide audience, because the population in question did not process the imminence of death the way our model required all populations to process it. He let that land, watching the gallery, watching which faces flinched and which did not. I want to be precise about what failed, because I do not believe this council has yet grasped it. It was not merely that humans proved harder to terrify. It was that the entire architecture of our conquest doctrine, 40 years, 11 campaigns, 400 million soldiers we did not lose because worlds surrendered instead of fighting, rested on an assumption about the universal nature of fear that we never once verified beyond 10 confirming instances, because 10 confirming instances felt, to every statistician who ever reviewed the model including myself, like more than enough. "You are telling this council," Vorik said slowly, "that the doctrine that built this empire was never actually proven. That it simply worked 10 times, and we mistook the pattern for a law." "Yes, General." "And the 11th instance?" "The 11th instance," Yeth said, "was a 7-year-old child who was not afraid, General, and who told our emperor his own name at the exact moment his own protocol required her to answer a question about her identity. And I have spent 3 weeks reviewing every biometric reading this doctrine ever recorded, on every world it ever conquered, and I can find no data anywhere in 40 years of records that adequately explains why. I do not believe the explanation is biological in a way our instruments can measure. I believe it is something closer to what humans call refusing to disappear. Whatever you name it, it is not fear management, and it is not performance, and it did not break under a demonstration that broke 9 other worlds without a single shot fired. He paused and allowed himself, for the first time in the whole testimony, something that was not quite emotion but stood close enough to it that half the gallery noticed. I would also like this council's formal record to reflect that Emperor Kesari, upon encountering this anomaly directly, chose, against 40 years of his own precedent, against a protocol he himself had never once deviated from in 11 campaigns, to halt the doctrine rather than force the demonstration to its conclusion. I do not offer this as an excuse for what the doctrine cost. I offer it because a full record should include the moment it stopped, not only the moment it started. The gallery was quiet for a long time after that. It was, Yeth understood, the closest thing to mercy his former emperor was going to receive from this room, and he had given it deliberately, because he had spent 40 years serving a man who had built an empire out of a wound he never let anyone see, and he found, in the end, that he could not testify to the wound's cost without also testifying to the moment it had finally, however briefly, told the truth. Kesari himself was not present in the chamber. The tribunal's terms, negotiated in the 3 weeks since Halcyon, had already settled his fate by the time Yeth's testimony began, not execution, which Vorik's faction had argued for hard in the first week and lost, and not restoration, which no one on the council had seriously proposed, but a formal stripping of title and command, permanent exile from any position of galactic authority. An extradition to a joint tribunal the Vanter Assembly had convened specifically to try him for crimes committed across 11 campaigns, a body with actual jurisdiction, actual victims, and no interest whatsoever in protecting the Ashfall Dominion's remaining political standing. He went to that second tribunal without resistance 3 months later and testified there for 6 days in detail about every campaign, every world, every number on a tally he no longer defended as strategy. He did not ask for leniency. He did not, notably, ever once claim the doctrine had been a mistake in its logic, only that its logic had been built on an assumption about fear that had turned out, on 1 world out of 11, to simply be untrue, and that he had spent 40 years unable to imagine that possibility because the alternative would have required him to examine why he'd needed the assumption to be true in the first place. On the 6th day before sentencing, the tribunal's chief magistrate, a Vanter jurist named Aset Ren, who had presided over 3 prior war crimes tribunals and had never once in a long career seen a defendant decline every offered mitigation, asked him, almost as an aside, off the formal record, why he had stopped. Kesari considered the question for a long moment before answering, in the flat, exhausted register that had replaced, somewhere over 3 months of captivity, the cold administrative certainty that had once run an empire. "I have asked myself that question every day since it happened," he said. "I built my entire understanding of strength on the belief that stillness meant a creature had learned to survive its own fear. I have read 10,000 faces through that belief and never once been wrong about what I found underneath them. On Halcyon, I found a child who was still and who was not hiding anything at all underneath it, and I did not have a category for that, because in 40 years, I had never once met a creature capable of standing in front of death without needing somewhere to put the fear." He looked, for the first time in the whole testimony, almost young. "I stopped because I did not know anymore which one of us in that room actually understood what strength was. And I was no longer certain it was me." The tribunal sentenced Dravan Kesari to permanent confinement on a neutral station under joint assembly custody, not death, not restoration, but a long, quiet remainder of a life spent, by the terms of his own sentencing statement, in service to a historical commission tasked with documenting exactly what the tally doctrine had cost across 11 campaigns. A sentence that struck some observers as too gentle, and others as the cruelest thing the tribunal could have devised. Forcing a man who had once refused to examine his own reflection to spend the rest of his life doing nothing else. Overseer Yeth Kalraman, granted immunity for his testimony, joined that commission voluntarily within the month, and would spend the next decade of his life turning the same statistical precision he had once used to perfect a terror doctrine toward the slower, harder work of proving, in exhaustive and permanent detail, exactly why it had been wrong. The Ashfall Dominion did not collapse all at once. Empires rarely do. But within a year, 6 of its 11 conquered systems had renegotiated their status through the Vanter Assembly, rather than continued Dominion administration. And General Sela Vorik, discovering that a throne built on a broken doctrine commanded far less automatic obedience than the doctrine's architect had ever needed to ask for, spent her interim command fighting a slow, grinding series of political battles that her predecessor's mere reputation would once have made unnecessary. The age of surrender by rumor alone was, across the sector, quietly, unglamorously over. Worlds still surrendered to real fleets, real sieges, real demonstrated force, the way wars had always actually been fought before one emperor discovered a cheaper method. But the cheaper method itself, the whisper that outran the fleet, the story that conquered a world before a single ship arrived, had lost the one thing it needed most to function, which was universal, untested belief. 8 months after Halcyon, a Corvin trade envoy named Ismarin docked at a modest way station on the edge of human-administered space to negotiate mineral rights for a mining consortium that had, until recently, done all its negotiating at gunpoint through Dominion intermediaries, and was now discovering, awkwardly, that it had to learn actual diplomacy instead. He had prepared for the meeting the way he had prepared for every meeting in a long trading career: research on the counterpart species, cultural notes, behavioral predictions drawn from whatever public data existed. What existed, for humans in the 8 months since Halcyon, was mostly one thing, replayed and analyzed and cited so extensively across every species' diplomatic corps that it had become, in a very short time, the single most referenced piece of footage in recorded galactic history. A small girl in a yellow coat, saying her own name to an emperor who could not answer. He had watched it 11 times before the meeting, the same number. He noted with a discomfort he did not examine too closely. That old core Vashton 4 systems away had watched it before deciding his own grandchildren's future was worth a defense auxiliary channel he'd never dared open before. He had expected, walking into the negotiation, some visible trace of what the footage implied, hardness, perhaps, or the particular flat menace he associated with species that had earned a fearsome reputation the honest way, through demonstrated violence rather than statistical modeling. He found, instead, a tired human logistics officer named Priya Anand, 20 years old now, running trade manifests for the Free Worlds Coalition's reconstruction effort, who negotiated the mineral rights with a directness that had nothing performative in it at all. No theater, no reputation being wielded like a weapon, simply a clear-eyed insistence on fair terms delivered without a single raised voice. "You are not what I expected," Marin admitted, near the end of the session, in the careful, over-honest way beings sometimes speak when a negotiation has gone well enough to relax the formal register. "What did you expect?" "I do not entirely know," he said, and meant it. "Something closer to the footage, I think. Something that would announce itself." Anand considered that for a moment, and something crossed her face that Marin, untrained in reading human expressions, unable to place it precisely, would later describe in his own trip report as the closest thing to weariness he had ever seen on a species barely into its 3rd decade of contact with the wider galaxy. "The footage isn't a performance either," she said finally. "That's kind of the whole point everyone keeps missing. Ren wasn't trying to scare anyone. She was just telling the truth in a room that had never once had to hear it before." She shrugged, an oddly casual gesture that undercut, deliberately or not, the weight of everything she'd just said. "Most of us are just trying to rebuild a colony and negotiate fair mineral rights, envoy. The footage is one afternoon. It's not who we are on the other 364 days of the year. Marin filed the exchange away in his report with a note he would later find quoted, without attribution, in a dozen other trading houses briefing documents across the sector, that the most unsettling thing about the species that had broken the Ashfall Dominion's terror doctrine was not that they were fearsome. It was that they seemed, on the whole, entirely uninterested in being fearsome at all, which left every observer with the considerably more unsettling task of guessing what they actually were instead. On Halcyon itself, the rebuilding took the shape rebuilding always takes after a wound too large to fully close. Slow, uneven, marked by good days and terrible ones in no predictable order. The grain silos rebuilt before the market clock rebuilt before anyone quite trusted the plaza enough to hold festivals in it again. Kaya Reyes stayed. She had assumed, in the exhausted days right after the liberation, that she would take the first transport off-world the moment one was offered, chase the version of herself that existed before 3 weeks of watching a tally climb from a rooftop, find some quieter corner of human space to disappear into. She found instead that Wren would not leave, could not be made to leave, clung to the only home she'd ever known with a stubbornness that outlasted every gentle argument. Kaya's aunt, Wren's mother, thin and hollowed by 3 days spent kneeling in a plaza not knowing whether her daughter would still be breathing at the end of it, could muster, and Kaya found, somewhere in the 6 months that followed, that she did not actually want to leave either. She took a position, eventually, with the Free Worlds Coalition's Reconstruction Liaison Office, coordinating exactly the kind of unglamorous logistics work Priya Anand had described to a Corvin envoy 8 months later: grain shipments, medical supply routes, the 1,000 small administrative tasks that turned a liberated world back into a living one. It suited her better than she expected. She had spent 3 weeks learning, from a rooftop, that the worst things in the galaxy sometimes had spreadsheets behind them. She found something almost restorative in spending her days building spreadsheets meant to feed people instead. Des Okonkwo retired from militia command within the year, his one good arm finally healed enough that the sling came off, but never fully regaining the strength it had before the North Bridge ambush, and took up, of all things, teaching a small classroom in the rebuilt schoolhouse 2 streets from the plaza, where he taught colony history to children who had been too young to remember the occupation clearly and children who had lived through every day of it, side by side, the way Halcyon had decided, collectively and without ever formally discussing it, that it wanted its history taught, not hidden, not sanitized, but not allowed to be the only thing the children knew about themselves either. Toma Ferris's marker in the plaza was replaced, eventually, by a proper memorial stone, and every year on the anniversary of the liberation, the colony gathered in the square that had once held 600 kneeling bodies and read his name aloud, along with the names of the 12 other Halcyon residents who had not survived the occupation, and a tradition Wren herself started, quietly, at 9 years old, without asking anyone's permission. The number 5731. Spoken once, slowly, by whoever's turn it was to lead the reading that year, so that the number would never again exist only on a banner meant to terrify, and would instead exist, at least once a year, as something remembered by people who refused to let it become only a statistic. Dravan Kesari spent the first 2 years of his confinement on the neutral station, in a silence so complete that even the commission's staff, tasked with extracting every remaining detail of 11 campaigns from a man legally obligated to provide it, sometimes wondered privately whether they were interviewing a person or simply transcribing a very thorough machine that had stopped believing in its own outputs. He answered every question put to him. He reviewed every casualty figure, cross-referenced every campaign timeline, confirmed dates and orders and command decisions with the same forensic precision he had once brought to reading a room full of frightened faces, because precision, he had discovered, was the only part of himself he still trusted to be honest. What he did not do for 2 years was volunteer anything beyond what was asked. And the Commission's junior historians, most of them born on worlds his doctrine had conquered, several of them the children of parents who had knelt in squares not unlike Halcyons, learned not to expect anything more from him than exactly what the question required. It was Yeth, in the third year, who finally asked him a question the Commission's formal charter had never required. "Do you ever think of her?" he said, one evening in the small shared office where the two of them had spent 3 years cataloging the worst decisions of both their lives, phrasing it carefully, the way he had learned over 4 decades to phrase anything that risked reopening a wound neither of them had fully closed. The girl. Kesari did not look up from the report he was annotating. "Every day," he said, "I have tried at various points to stop. It has not worked." "What do you think of specifically?" "I think of the 4 seconds," Kesari said. "I built a career on the certainty that 4 seconds was enough time to find the truth in anyone's face. I have spent 3 years discovering that 4 seconds was never the problem. It was that I had spent 40 years asking the wrong question in that window. I kept asking what someone was hiding. I never once asked what it would look like if there were nothing to hide." He set the annotation stylus down, finally, and looked at Yeth directly, an old man now by any measure that mattered even if his body had years left in it. "I do not know if I would have been a different man if someone had taught me that question 40 years ago, in a cold courtyard, instead of teaching me stillness. I suspect I will spend whatever is left of my life not knowing, and I have decided that is an appropriate sentence, whatever the tribunal formally called it." The letter arrived 4 months later, forwarded through the Commission's secure intake with a note from the Halcyon Reconstruction Liaison Office flagging it for review before delivery, standard protocol for any correspondence directed at a war criminal from a survivor of his own campaigns. It was short. It had clearly been drafted and redrafted by someone old enough now to choose words carefully, and young enough to still write in the slightly too formal register of a person practicing at being more grown-up than she felt. "I am 12 now," it read. "My teacher, Mr. Okonkwohale, says I don't have to send this and that it's okay if I want to wait or never send it at all. I've thought about it for a long time. I wanted you to know that I don't hate you, and I also don't forgive you because I don't think those are the only 2 things a person can feel about something, even though everyone keeps asking me which one it is. I think about that day sometimes. Not the scary parts mostly. I think about how you looked at me like you didn't know what I was, and I've decided that's the part I'm glad happened, because I think if you had known what I was, you would have known how to keep doing what you were doing, and you didn't, and that's the only reason I'm still here to write this letter. My Aunt Kaya says the Commission is trying to make sure what happened on Halcyon gets written down honestly so it can't happen to anyone else. I hope that's true. I hope you're helping with that and not just saying you are. That's the only thing I wanted to ask actually. Are you actually helping? Ren." Kesari read it 11 times the day it arrived, and then, for the first time in 4 decades, wrote a letter of his own that no protocol required of him, and rewrote it 9 times before he judged it honest enough to send, and the final version preserved eventually, in the Commission's public archive alongside the rest of the Tally Doctrine's dismantling, because Ren herself, years later, chose to make both letters part of the historical record rather than keep them private. Read simply. "I am helping. It is the only thing I have left that is worth doing, and I intend to keep doing it for as long as this station allows me to hold a stylus. I do not ask you to believe that. I would not have believed it either 4 years ago from a man like the one I was. I want you to know that your question was fair, and that I did not answer it quickly, because I wanted the answer to be true and not merely comforting, and those are not always the same thing. Thank you for asking it directly. No one else on this station has, in 3 years, had the courage to ask me anything that wasn't already in the file." They did not exchange further letters after that, not for several years, though Yeth, who read both, with the Commission's oversight permission, before they were sealed into the archive, kept a private copy of each, and would say, decades later, to historians who asked him what had finally convinced him the Commission's work meant something beyond the punishment it was legally structured to be, that it was not any single campaign report or casualty figure. It was a war criminal and a 12-year-old survivor managing, across a distance neither of them chose, to have a more honest conversation about what had happened between them than any tribunal in the sector had managed to have about the doctrine itself. 6 years after Halcyon, in a training barracks on a rebuilt Corvin recruiting world that had once supplied ground troops to the HFY Dominion's 11 campaigns, and now supplied them, under considerably more scrutiny, to a joint sector defense coalition, a grizzled instructor named Coral Bassick stood in front of 40 new recruits and did something he did at the start of every cohort without fail. Regardless of how many times his superiors suggested it might be time to update the curriculum, he played the footage. Not the whole thing. The recruits had all seen the whole thing a dozen times before ever reaching his classroom. It was required viewing in every sector defense academy from 3 systems out. Part of a mandatory ethics module the Vanter Assembly had insisted upon in the treaty that formally dissolved what remained of the HFY Dominion's military authority. He played only the last 11 seconds, the 4-second window and the 7 that followed it, the small girl's steady eyes and the tall gray emperor's frozen stillness, and he let it run twice before he spoke. "Every one of you," he said, "has been taught somewhere in your training that fear is a resource, same as fuel or ammunition, and that a good commander manages it the way he manages any other resource, his own troops, his enemies, doesn't matter. Fear is fear, and fear can be modeled. This is true. It has been true for as long as anyone has kept records of warfare. I want you to look at this footage and understand that it is also, in at least one documented instance, catastrophically incomplete. A recruit near the front, young, eager in the specific way first-week recruits were always eager before the training ground the eagerness down into something more useful, raised a hand. "Sir, with respect, that's one child. One data point." The Commission's own report says the anomaly rate across the full occupation was under 20%. Under 20% of one world, Bassick said. "I want you to sit with that number for a moment, recruit, because I sat with it myself for a long time before I understood why it should terrify you more than 100% would. If every human on that world had shown the exact same fear response our old model predicted, we would have a clean explanation, some cultural training, some collective discipline drilled into an entire population, something you could counter with a different strategy, a better demonstration, more force applied more precisely. 20% isn't clean. 20% means it wasn't trained into them uniformly. It means it's simply available to some of them, unpredictably, for reasons 40 years of the finest statistical modeling this Dominion ever built could not identify, isolate, or counter. You cannot plan around a variable you cannot predict. That is the actual lesson of Halcyon, and it is not a comforting one, and I would rather every single one of you leave this room afraid of that fact than confident in a doctrine that has already been proven once on camera, in front of the whole sector, to fail exactly when it mattered most." He let the recruits sit with that for a long moment before he continued, quieter now, less lecture and more the particular flat honesty of a man who had, in fact, been part of the ground detail retreating off Halcyon's Plaza 6 years earlier, though he had never once told a training cohort that directly and did not intend to start today. "I am not telling you humans cannot be defeated," he said. "I am telling you that anyone who tells you they can be reliably terrified into surrender has not actually done the arithmetic, and I have watched, personally, what happens to an empire that built its entire military doctrine on the arithmetic being simpler than it actually is. Respect them as an adversary the way you would respect any adversary, with real force, real strategy, real caution. But if your plan for winning a conflict with a human world depends on a demonstration convincing enough to break their nerve before the fighting starts, I want you to remember this footage. And I want you to build a different plan. Because I promise you, on the strength of the worst professional mistake of my career, that the demonstration is not guaranteed to work. And the 11 seconds it takes to discover that in front of your own command structure and a sector-wide audience is not a cost any of you can afford to pay to learn it. The recruit who had raised the objection did not raise another one. None of them did for the rest of that session, and Bassick, watching 40 young faces absorb a lesson he had learned the hard way on an open plaza, he still dreamed about more nights than he would ever admit to anyone, allowed himself, briefly, the small cold satisfaction of a teacher who believed, against considerable evidence to the contrary, that some mistakes really could be taught rather than repeated. The Commission's full report on the Tally Doctrine, published in its 9th year of compilation, running to 11 volumes, cross-referenced against every campaign's raw data, every biometric reading, every casualty figure the Ashfall Dominion had ever recorded across 4 decades of terror-based conquest, and its central finding, the one line that every subsequent sector history textbook would eventually reduce the entire 11 volumes to, for better or worse, was simple enough to fit on a single page, even though it had taken a war criminal and his former statistician 9 years to prove it with the rigor the finding deserved. Fear, the report concluded, does not scale as a universal constant. It is not a resource that behaves identically across every population subjected to it, and any doctrine built on the assumption that it does will eventually encounter a population for whom the assumption is false, and the doctrine will not survive the encounter, because the doctrine's entire authority depends on nobody ever discovering that the encounter was possible in the first place. Yeth Kalraman, listed as co-author on all 11 volumes despite the tribunal's decision, years earlier, to grant him immunity rather than prosecution, a decision that had drawn its own share of criticism from worlds that felt a statistician who built the model deserved as much accountability as the emperor who wielded it, spent the report's publication week doing press interviews he had never wanted and answering, over and over, in different words each time, a version of the same question every interviewer eventually asked him. Did he blame himself? He answered it honestly each time because he had promised himself 3 years into the Commission's work that honesty was the only currency he had left worth spending. Yes, he told them. He had built the model. He had watched it hold for 10 campaigns, and never once, in 4 decades, questioned whether 10 was actually enough evidence to call something a law rather than a pattern that had simply not yet failed. He had spent 9 years since trying to make that failure mean something more durable than a single afternoon's humiliation on a broadcast feed, and he did not know, even now, whether the 11 volumes he had helped write would actually stop the next ambitious commander from building a new version of the same doctrine on a different premise, because he had learned, across 4 decades of service to a man who had built an empire on exactly that mistake, that the people most certain their model could never fail were always, without exception, the ones least equipped to notice when it already had. Yeth Kalraman outlived his former emperor by 6 years, and spent every one of them exactly as he had told a 12-year-old girl he would, helping, in whatever limited way the Commission's charter allowed, to make certain a broken doctrine could never again be mistaken for an unbreakable law. He never remarried, never sought further rank, never once asked the tribunal to reconsider the immunity that had let him keep working instead of standing trial beside the man he'd served for 40 years. A mercy he privately believed, until the end, he had not entirely earned, and used precisely because of that belief, as fuel for a decade of the most exacting statistical honesty of his career. His final act as director of the Commission's archive was to seal, per Wren's own written wishes, both of her letters to Kesari and both of Kesari's replies into the permanent public record, unedited, exactly as written, with a short annotation in his own hand explaining why. That a doctrine built on refusing to let anyone see a wound honestly should be answered, in its dismantling, by nothing less than the same honesty it had spent 4 decades refusing to extend to anyone standing in front of it. He died in his sleep, on the same neutral station where he'd spent his last years, and the commission's staff, most of them born on worlds his own statistics had once helped conquer, held a small, quiet observance for him that he would have found. He joked more than once in his final year, entirely too generous for a man who had spent 4 decades building the very machine he'd finally helped take apart. On the 10th anniversary of the liberation, Halcyon's plaza filled before dawn the way it always did on that particular morning. The market clock, rebuilt in the 2nd year, restored to working order in the 4th. A small, unglamorous miracle nobody who hadn't lived through its absence could fully appreciate, chiming the hour over a crowd that had grown, year by year, from the handful of exhausted survivors who'd gathered around a burned marker in the dirt to something closer to the whole colony. Several thousand strong now, along with visitors who came each year from other worlds specifically to stand in the square where the footage had happened. Kaya Reyes, 34 now, stood near the front with an ease in her shoulders that had taken most of those 10 years to earn, watching Ren climb the small platform that had been built, deliberately, in a different spot than the original steel one, close enough to carry the memory, and far enough that nobody had to stand on the exact ground where it happened. Ren was 17. She had grown into a tall, quiet young woman with her mother's dark eyes, and an unhurried way of carrying herself that had never fully left her since the day a tyrant had failed to find fear in her face, though she would have told anyone who asked, and people did ask, constantly, more than she wanted, a burden she had learned to carry without complaint but never without cost, that she did not remember feeling especially brave that day. She remembered being tired and confused and wanting her mother, and she had spent a decade being turned, gradually and against her own preference, into a symbol of something she still did not fully recognize in the retellings. She had refused every offer to make a formal career out of it, the interviews, the sector lecture circuit, the historical dramatizations 3 different production houses had pitched over the years, all of which she had turned down flat, more than once with words sharper than the polite version Kaya usually heard her use. What she had agreed to, every year without fail, was this: standing on this platform on this morning and reading the names. She read the 13 Halcyon residents who had not survived the occupation first, slow, deliberate, each name given the same unhurried weight regardless of how many times the crowd had heard it before. She read Toma Ferris's name and paused, as she always paused, for the 11 seconds his sacrifice had bought, a tradition she had started herself at 9 years old and never explained to anyone, though everyone who'd been there understood exactly what the pause was for. And then last, the way she always closed it, she said the number. 5,731. She let it sit in the quiet plaza for a long moment, the way she always let it sit, the crowd's silence different in texture than any other silence in the whole ceremony. Not grief exactly. Not anymore. 10 years having worn the sharpest edge off that particular pain even if it had never fully closed, but something closer to a shared, deliberate refusal to let a number that had once been designed to terrify a galaxy simply fade back into being only a number again. That's how many children a doctrine killed, she said, the same words she used every year, plain, unadorned, because she had decided a long time ago that the number needed nothing added to it to carry its own weight. It's not a symbol. It's not a lesson. It was 5,731 specific kids with specific names, most of which nobody outside their own families ever learned, because the whole point of a tally is to turn a name into a number so nobody has to hold the weight of the name. I only know one of those names because it's mine, and because I happen to be the 5,732nd, and the count stopped one child short of me. She paused, and something in her face, Kaya, watching from the crowd, recognized it instantly. The same steady, unhurried attention that had once undone an emperor settled into the particular stillness the whole colony had learned to associate with the parts of this speech that mattered most. I don't know why it stopped. People have spent 10 years and 11 volumes trying to explain it, and I've read most of it, and I still don't have a better answer than the one I gave when I was 7, which is that I told him my name, and he looked at me like he didn't know what to do with someone who wasn't afraid of him, and I think that's actually the whole answer. Not a strategy, not a trick. Just a kid telling the truth in a room that had never once had to hear it. She looked out over the crowd, colonists who had knelt in this square, children born after the liberation who had never known any halcyon but the rebuilt one, visitors from worlds that had rescinded their own surrenders in the ripple that followed this exact morning 10 years earlier. And her voice, when she continued, had lost none of the plainness that had made it, a decade ago, more dangerous to a tyrant's doctrine than any fleet in the sector. I don't think the lesson is that we're fearless. I've been afraid plenty of times since. I was afraid an hour before I walked up to that platform 10 years ago. I just didn't have room left to perform it for anyone, because I was busy being afraid in the actual, private, human way that doesn't announce itself to an audience. She let that land. I think the lesson, if there's one worth keeping, out of everything this square has cost, is that fear and surrender were never actually the same thing, no matter how many worlds got convinced otherwise. You can be scared and still say your own name clearly. You can be scared and still refuse to disappear into somebody else's spreadsheet. That's not a superpower. It's just what happens when you decide, however scared you are, that you're still going to be exactly who you already were, right up until the end, instead of becoming whatever the person killing you needs you to become to make it easier for them. She stepped back from the platform's edge, the speech's plainness giving way, as it always did at the very end, to something quieter and more personal, meant less for the crowd than for the small circle of people who had actually been there. That's it. That's the whole lesson. It just took a very expensive number to teach it to a galaxy that should have already known. The crowd did not applaud, the way it never applauded at this particular moment in the ceremony, because applause had always felt wrong for what the morning was actually for. Instead, the way Halcyon had done every year for a decade, they simply stood together in the quiet plaza a while longer, the market clock's slow chime marking a morning that had once belonged entirely to a machine built to prove that terror always won, and now belonged instead to a colony that had outlived the machine and built something ordinary and stubborn and alive on top of the ground where it had failed. Afterward, once the crowd had thinned, and the visitors from other worlds had drifted toward the Reconstruction Office's small welcome center to ask the questions Ren had spent 10 years learning to deflect with patient, practiced grace. Kaya found her cousin sitting alone on the platform's edge, legs dangling over the side, looking out at an empty plaza the way she always did after the reading, needing a few private minutes before she could be anyone's symbol again. "You did good," Kaya said, settling beside her, the old ache in her knees a reminder of a decade of reconstruction work that had never once felt as urgent as 3 days spent watching from a rooftop, and had, in its own slow way, mattered just as much. "You always do good. You know that, right?" "I know." Ren leaned her head against Kaya's shoulder, 17 years old and for this one private moment, allowed to be exactly that instead of the thing the sector's historians kept trying to make her into. "I got a letter this week, from the commission. They said his health's declining. Yeth wanted to know if I'd want to know when it happens." Kaya was quiet a moment, weighing the question the way she'd learned to weigh most things Ren brought to her, not rushing an answer, letting the girl she'd raised as much as her actual mother had find her own way to what she thought about it. "What did you tell them?" "I said yes." Ren watched the empty square, the platform's shadow stretching long across ground that had held 600 kneeling colonists a decade ago and now held nothing but morning light and the faint, ordinary sound of the market beginning its day 2 streets over. Not because I need anything from him. I stopped needing anything from him a long time ago, I think, somewhere around the third or fourth letter, once I understood he wasn't going to give me some big explanation that made it all make sense, because there wasn't one. She was quiet for a moment, choosing the next words with the same unhurried care she brought to everything, the trait that had once undone an empire and now simply made her, in the ordinary texture of her actual life, a careful and deliberate person to talk to. I think I just want to know when it happens, because I was there for the beginning of whatever he became after that day, and it feels wrong to not know how it ends, even if I don't feel anything in particular about the ending itself. That's fair, Kaya said, and meant it, because 10 years of reconstruction work had taught her that closure rarely looked like the tidy thing people wanted it to look like, and mostly looked like this instead. A 17-year-old sitting on the edge of a memorial platform, working out in real time exactly how much space a man who had once terrified a galaxy was allowed to keep occupying in her life, and deciding, deliberately, that the answer was less than everyone assumed and more than nothing at all. Des Okonkwohale found them there 20 minutes later, older now, the gray that had touched only his temples a decade ago having spread through the rest of his hair, walking with a cane he claimed he only needed on cold mornings and used in practice most days of the year. He'd retired from teaching 2 years earlier, though half the colony still called him the commander, out of old habit, and he still showed up at every anniversary reading, standing at the back where he could watch the whole crowd without being watched himself. "Fleet liaisons asking for you, Rays," he said, settling onto the platform's edge on Kaya's other side with the careful, deliberate motion of a man whose joints had opinions about sitting on hard steel. "New allocation request for the eastern settlements. They want your read on it before the afternoon session. Tell them I'll be there in an hour." Told them that already. He looked out at the plaza with them for a while, the three of them sitting in a row on a platform that had, a decade ago, held a different and far worse configuration of people, and none of them said anything for a long moment, because some silences on this particular morning didn't need filling. "You know," he said eventually, to no one in particular, "I used to think about that night in the culvert, Toma's hand going cold in mine. I used to think, some years, that it was the worst night of my life, and I'd feel guilty about it, because Ren's the one everyone remembers, Ren's the one who did the thing that actually mattered, and here I was still carrying around one dead kid from a rescue mission that didn't even work." He shook his head slowly. "Took me a long time to understand it wasn't a competition. That a night can be the worst night of your life, and also just be one more piece of a much bigger thing that turned out, somehow, against every likelihood, to end somewhere worth ending up." "Toma's 11 seconds still count," Ren said quietly, without looking away from the empty square. "Every year when I read his name, I mean it. It's not separate from the rest of it. Without the relay, the assembly doesn't see it live. Without the assembly seeing it live, the Thren interceptors don't come. Without the interceptors, the fleet doesn't get its window." She finally looked over at Okonkwohale, 17 years old and speaking, in that moment, with the plain, careful gravity that had once made a tyrant forget how to give an order. "You keep acting like your part of it was smaller because it happened in a ditch instead of on a platform with cameras. It wasn't smaller. It just didn't get filmed." Okonkwohale didn't answer that right away. When he did, his voice had gone rougher than the cold morning air alone accounted for. "You've gotten entirely too wise for 17, you know that." "Everyone keeps telling me that," Ren said, and something almost like a smile crossed her face, the first properly unguarded expression she'd shown all morning. "I keep telling them I just had an unusually specific education." The message from the commission came 4 years later, on an ordinary autumn evening, relayed through the same secure channel that had carried a 12-year-old's letter a decade before it. Dravan Kesari had died in his sleep, quietly, at the age the commission's medical staff had long expected, having spent the final 11 years of his life doing exactly what he told a 12-year-old he would do: helping, in whatever limited way a man in his position could help, to make sure the doctrine that had once made him the most feared name in the sector could never again be mistaken for an unbreakable law of the universe. Wren, 21 by then, read the notice twice, sitting alone in the small apartment she kept above the reconstruction office where she'd taken a junior position 2 years earlier, following, to nobody's great surprise, least of all her own, in the exact unglamorous footsteps of the aunt who had raised her. She did not cry. She had expected distantly for years that she might, when this particular message finally arrived, and found instead that what she actually felt was something quieter and harder to name, not grief, not relief, something closer to the sensation of a long, complicated sentence finally, properly, ending. She did not attend any commemoration, because there was none to attend. The commission handled his remains with the same clinical, unglamorous precision it had handled the 11 volumes of his doctrine's dismantling, and the sector's news relays gave the death perhaps 4 sentences before moving on to whatever else the day required attention for. She thought, instead, about the letter she'd write to Yeth in the morning, thanking him for telling her, and about the reading she'd give again in the spring. The same words mostly, the same number, the same 11-second pause for a man who had bled out in a ditch to buy a relay tap 11 more seconds it needed to hold. And she thought, before she finally turned off the light, about a 7-year-old in a dust-dulled yellow coat standing in front of the tallest, coldest figure she had ever seen, being asked for her designation, and giving, instead, the only thing she had ever actually needed to give. Her name. It had cost her nothing to say it. It had cost the man who heard it everything he'd spent 40 years building. That asymmetry, one small human word, offered without weight, without performance, without a single second of fear left over to spend on anyone watching, had, in the end, done more to break an empire than every fleet the sector could have assembled against it. And Wren, 21 years old, sitting alone in a rebuilt colony on a world that had refused, against every calculation a tyrant's own instruments had ever run, to disappear into somebody else's arithmetic, understood at last that this had never really been a story about her at all. It had only ever been a story about the number, and the name, and a 7-year-old's quiet, stubborn discovery that the second one, spoken plainly by someone with nothing left to hide behind it, would always, eventually, outlast the first. Rhett Ilving told the story more times than he could count in the years after Halcyon, to more audiences than he'd ever expected a single reckless orbital gamble to earn him, and he told it, without exception, the same careful way every time, because he had learned early that the version people wanted to hear, 6 brave ships against 3 cruisers, a daring rescue, a clean and simple victory, was not the true version, and he had decided, somewhere in the first year of retelling it, that the true version mattered more than the satisfying one. I did not break formation because I was certain we would win, he told a graduating class of Thren border cadets, 15 years after the fact, an old man by then, his flight days long behind him, invited back to his old training academy, the way veterans of a particular kind of event always eventually got invited back. I broke formation because I watched 11 seconds of footage on my ready room screen and understood, with a clarity I have never experienced before or since, that if I did not act in the next 90 seconds, I would spend the rest of my life having watched a child stand alone in front of an empire and done nothing. And I found that I could not live with that math more than I could not live with the far more reasonable math of 6 ships against 3 cruisers. He paused, the way he always paused at this point in the telling, letting the cadets sit with the discomfort of a lesson that offered them no clean tactical principle to write down. I want to be honest with you, because it is the only honest thing I have to offer that 30 years of service hasn't already taught you in 1,000 other forms. I do not recommend my decision as a strategy. It worked because a Corvin command structure happened to be collapsing at the exact moment I made it, and if it had not been collapsing, I would have led 6 ships and everyone aboard them into a fight none of us survived, for a gesture that would have meant nothing to anyone except the people who loved us. He looked out over the cadets, young, most of them not yet tested by anything that would teach them what he was trying, imperfectly, to teach them now. I am not telling you this story, so you'll believe good instincts always get rewarded. I'm telling it because sometimes the instinct is right regardless of the odds, and you will not get a clean signal in advance telling you which time is which. And the only thing I can promise you is that the version of yourself who acts anyway and is wrong will still be able to live with themselves in a way the version who calculates the odds perfectly and does nothing never quite manages to. He did not mention, in most tellings, the 11 months of nightmares that had followed the engagement, the 2 crew members he'd lost to a debris strike in the withdrawal that never made it into any official commendation, the long private cost of a decision the whole sector remembered as uncomplicated heroism. He mentioned it to exactly one person, years later, at a reunion of Halcyon liberation veterans that had become, almost against anyone's original intention, an annual gathering, told it plainly, over a quiet drink, to Kaya Reyes, who had by then spent enough of her own life carrying the private cost of a public story to understand exactly what he meant without needing it explained twice. Everybody wants the version where it was simple, he told her. 6 ships, 1 signal, a clean win. Nobody wants the version where I threw up in my flight suit 20 minutes after the burn because I genuinely believed, right up until the Corvine cruisers actually broke orbit, that I'd just gotten every person under my command killed for nothing. He turned his glass slowly on the table between them. You were on that rooftop 3 days before any of it, Reyes. I only had to be brave for 90 seconds. You had to watch it happen in slow motion for 3 days and keep functioning anyway. I've never once told anyone that your part of this was harder than mine, because nobody ever asks the question that way. I'm telling you now. Kaya didn't have a ready answer for that, and didn't try to manufacture one, because 15 years of living inside the aftermath of Halcyon had taught her that the truest response to that kind of honesty was usually just to let it sit in the room a while, unadorned, the way Ren had learned to let a number sit in a quiet plaza once a year without rushing to explain it away. We were all just doing the next necessary thing, she said finally. Nobody had a plan big enough to hold the whole shape of it. We just kept doing the next piece in front of us and hoping the pieces added up to something. They did, Ilvin said. That's the part that still gets me some nights. They actually did. Priya Anand never did become the sector-famous engineer. Half the trade envoys who passed through Halcyon in the following years seemed to expect her to be. She stayed with the Reconstruction Office for 3 years after the liberation, helping wire the colony's rebuilt communications grid with the same patient, unglamorous precision she'd once used to bond a passive relay to a Dominion tower in 11 seconds flat, and then left, quietly, to study signals engineering formally on a coalition university world, and came back, 6 years later, to teach it instead of practicing it anywhere more prestigious. People keep asking why I didn't take one of the fleet commissions, she told a visiting journalist once, a decade after the liberation. In an interview she agreed to only because the Reconstruction Office asked her to and regretted almost immediately, because the journalist kept trying to steer the conversation toward the drama of the tower run, and she kept steering it back toward the mathematics. I built a relay because it was the only tool I had that might actually change something, and it did, and I'm proud of that, but I don't think what I'm good at is running toward gunfire. I think what I'm good at is teaching 17-year-olds how a carrier signal actually works, so that the next time some colony needs a passive tap built in 6 hours under threat of execution, there are more than 1 or 2 people in the sector who know how to do it without needing a miracle. She'd shrugged, in the same oddly casual way she'd once shrugged off a Corvine envoy's astonishment. Ren gets asked to be a symbol for the rest of her life whether she wants it or not, because you can't really teach someone else how to be exactly who she was in that one specific moment. I got lucky. What I did is teachable. So I teach it, and some of my students have already gone on to build things I never would have thought of, and that feels like a better use of whatever I've got left to give than a fleet commission ever would have. She kept, for the rest of her career, a single component from the original relay housing, not the whole device, which the commission had long ago claimed for its permanent archive, but a small salvaged fragment of the medical scanner casing she'd built it from, sitting on her desk in the university's signals lab, unlabeled, unremarked upon, meaningful to exactly one person in any given room, until a student finally worked up the nerve to ask what it was. General Sela Vorik did not survive her rule long enough to see the commission's report published. She had wanted the Ashfall throne for a decade before Halcyon handed it to her broken, and she spent the 5 years she held it discovering, the hard way, that a throne inherited from a doctrine's collapse commanded almost none of the automatic obedience the doctrine itself had once provided for free. She tried in her first year to rebuild a version of the tally under a different name, quieter, more selective, aimed only at the system still nominally loyal to what remained of Ashfall authority, and found, to her genuine and lasting fury, that the demonstration no longer worked even on populations who had once surrendered to it without complaint, because the one thing her predecessors' 40 years of careful terror had required above all else. An audience that had never once seen the doctrine fail no longer existed anywhere in range of a functioning relay. Every subject world she tried it on had already watched 11 seconds of a frozen emperor 100 times over. The demonstration landed like a joke told to a room that had already heard the punchline. She was deposed in her 6th year by a coalition of her own regional governors, not through any grand rebellion, but through the slow, unglamorous erosion of a command structure that had lost its only reliable currency and never found another one to replace it. And she spent the remainder of her life in a modest exile on a mining world 12 systems from the throne she had once wanted badly enough to help break the man who held it. History, in the sector's eventual reckoning, remembered her mostly as a footnote, the second and final ruler of an empire whose actual undoing had already happened, fully and irreversibly, on an open plaza on a small farming world, months before she ever sat the throne at all. She understood this about her own legacy long before she died, and was heard, by the handful of former officers who still visited her in exile, to say more than once that she had spent 5 years ruling the wreckage of a doctrine and calling it an empire, and that she had never quite forgiven Kesari for teaching her, indirectly and far too late to matter, that an empire built on fear alone was never actually an empire at all. Only a very large, very expensive rumor, waiting for the one audience member who wouldn't play along. What replaced the Ashfall Dominion in the decades that followed was not a single unified successor state, but something messier, and by most sector historians' later accounting, considerably more durable. A loose patchwork of independent systems, several of them the same worlds that had once surrendered to Kesari's doctrine without a shot fired, now governing themselves through negotiated compacts with the Vanter Assembly, and increasingly, with the Free Worlds coalition that had grown in the years after Halcyon, from a handful of human colonial defense forces into a sector-recognized mediating power, whose word carried weight not because anyone feared what it would do if defied, but because it had spent 2 decades demonstrating, patiently and without much drama, that it kept the agreements it made. Old Kor Vashton's granddaughter, the signals officer who had opened the first defense auxiliary channel her world, had dared open in 4 campaigns, went on to help negotiate her homeworld's founding charter as an independent mining consortium, and kept, framed in her office for the rest of her working life, a printed still from the footage that had made the conversation with her grandfather possible in the first place. Not out of reverence for violence, she told visitors who asked, but as a reminder of exactly how expensive it had been for anyone to finally prove the old doctrine's number could be wrong. On Earth itself, in the years that followed, the footage became something stranger than a historical record. It became a kind of unwelcome inheritance, discussed in classrooms and defense ministries, and late-night broadcasts in tones that ranged from grim pride to open discomfort, because no two human institutions ever quite agreed on what, exactly, the rest of the galaxy had actually learned about them that afternoon. The Colonial Defense Council, newly folded into the growing Free Worlds Coalition, and eager to build deterrence out of anything it could find, wanted to lean into the footage hard, commission recruitment material around it, cite it in every negotiation with a wary alien trade partner. Let the reputation do the diplomatic lifting the way Kesari's own doctrine once had, except now working in humanity's favor instead of against it. It was Ambassador Solène Cray, still serving the Assembly a decade after her floor speech had helped turn a vote, who argued the Council out of it, in a closed session that later leaked, deliberately, into the public record specifically because she wanted it leaked. "You are proposing," she told the assembled council in that session, "that we take the single most important thing an alien empire ever learned about us, that we cannot be reliably terrorized into submission, and turn it into a threat. Do you understand what that actually does? It tells every world watching that we've decided to become the thing that broke us free of Kesari's doctrine in the first place, an empire that governs by reputation instead of proof. We did not win anything on Halcyon by being fearsome. We won it by being exactly, plainly, unglamorously ourselves in a room built to make that impossible. If we spend the next 50 years turning that into a marketing campaign for how scary we are, we will lose the actual thing that made it matter, and we will lose it faster than Kesari lost his doctrine, because at least his doctrine was built on something that had worked 10 times running. Ours would be built on nothing but our own vanity about one very good afternoon." The council did not fully take her advice. No institution ever fully takes the advice that costs it the most convenient shortcut available, but it took enough of it that the recruitment material never got made, and the footage, over the following decades, settled into something closer to what Cray had argued for. Not a weapon, not a boast, but a fact, taught plainly in defense academies and colonial history courses alongside all of humanity's other complicated inheritances, presented without triumphalism to students who mostly, Cray found when she visited those classrooms herself in her later years, responded to it the same quiet way Ren Calder always insisted was the only honest response available. Not pride exactly. Something closer to a solemn, private recognition that the trait the footage had revealed was neither an achievement nor an accident, only a fact about the species they happened to belong to, a fact that had cost one specific colony an unbearable amount to prove, and that came with no guarantee at all that it would hold the next time some new tyrant, on some new world, decided to test it against a different room full of frightened children who might, for all anyone honestly knew, respond in exactly the pattern the old doctrine had always predicted. Every serious historian who studied the Halcyon record eventually arrived at the same uncomfortable footnote, one the Commission's 11 volumes stated as plainly as Yeth Cowherman could bring himself to state anything. The anomaly had never been guaranteed. It had simply, on one specific afternoon, on one specific platform, been true, and no doctrine, not the one that broke on it, and not any replacement built to celebrate its breaking, could responsibly promise it would be true again. That uncertainty, more than any triumph, was what the sector actually inherited from Halcyon, and it was, in its own quiet way, the more honest legacy for it. Halcyon's plaza, on an ordinary evening some 20 years after the liberation, looked very little like the place it had been on the morning the tally reached its number. The market clock kept its steady time over stalls that sold grain and dyed wool, and the small handmade goods of a colony that had, decade by decade, stopped being defined by the worst 3 days in its history, and become, instead, simply a place where people lived, argued about water rights, raised children who had never known anything but peace, and gathered once a year to make certain the worst 3 days were never allowed to be forgotten either. Wren called her. She had taken her mother's family name formally at 25. A small, quiet decision that had nothing to do with the letters or the commission or the sector's endless appetite for her story, and everything to do with simply wanting, after so many years of being asked to carry a symbol, to also just be a person with an ordinary surname. Still gave the reading every spring, though she was older now. And the crowd that gathered had long since stopped needing her presence to make the ceremony matter, because the colony had taught its own children the words by heart, the way any community eventually absorbs its founding grief into its own bloodstream and stops requiring a single voice to carry it. She stood that particular evening, not on the platform but at its edge, watching a group of children, none of whom had been alive for the occupation, all of whom had grown up knowing the number the way other children elsewhere grew up knowing a prayer or an anthem, running through the square in the last hour of daylight, chasing each other around the memorial stone with the specific, unbothered carelessness that Wren understood, better than almost anyone alive. Was the actual point of everything that had happened here, not the reading, not the commission's 11 volumes, not even the number itself, spoken aloud once a year in a hushed and careful voice. The point had always been this: children who could run through this square without knowing, in their bodies, what it had once cost to make that possible. Kaya found her there, older herself now, silver threading through hair that had been dark on a rooftop 20 years earlier, and stood beside her a while, the two of them watching the children the way they'd once watched a very different scene unfold across the same ground. "You ever think about it?" Kaya asked, after a long, comfortable silence. "What would have happened if you'd been afraid, actually afraid the way he expected? If the 4 seconds had gone the way they went for everyone before you?" Wren considered the question with the same unhurried care she'd always brought to everything, the trait that had once, in a single quiet moment, undone a man who had built his entire understanding of the universe around never being surprised by it. "I don't think it would have changed who I was," she said finally. "I think I would have been just as scared as any of the other 31 kids in that line, and it wouldn't have made me any less myself. Being afraid was never the opposite of anything, Kaya. That's what I keep trying to tell people, and it's the part they always seem to miss." She watched the children a moment longer, small and loud and gloriously unafraid of anything more serious than the coming dark and their own supper being late. "I think what actually happened is smaller and stranger than the story everyone tells about it. I wasn't brave. I was 7, and tired, and I'd had 3 days to run out of any fear left to perform for an audience. And when he asked me who I was, I just told him, because it was the only true thing I had left to give him, and it turned out the truth was the one thing his whole doctrine never had a column for." The sun dropped lower over the grain silos, the market clock chimed the evening hour, and somewhere in the square a child laughed at something that had nothing to do with tyrants or tallies or a word spoken once, 20 years ago, into a silence built to swallow it, and Wren called her, watching that ordinary, unremarkable, entirely undramatic sound carry across a plaza that had once held 600 kneeling bodies, and a machine built to prove that fear always won, understood. Finally and completely, that this was what the 11 seconds had actually bought. Not glory, not vengeance, not even, really, a lesson the galaxy had fully learned, because galaxies rarely learned anything as cleanly as the stories told about them afterward suggested. Just this, an ordinary evening, children who didn't have to be brave because somebody else already had been once, so they'd never have to find out whether they could be.